Good morning, everybody. My name is Darcy Young. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. And I'm so pleased to welcome you here today for our second annual Science Symposium, Wild Things in the Narragansett Bay Region. We're really happy to be here at beautiful Roger Williams University this morning. And here to deliver a welcome from the university is Dr. Margaret Everett, who's the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs. Thanks, Margaret.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all to our university and to what I know is going to be a great day of conversation and learning. On behalf of Roger Williams University, I want to welcome you to today's symposium on wild things in the Narragansett Bay Region. We're really delighted to be hosting this event and the rich conversations I know it will engender with the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. 2 years ago, Roger Williams University became the host organization for the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and we're so pleased to have them as part of our community and our campus and to work with them on programming like this. Already, Darcy and her staff and the broader steering committee of the program have built significant connections with our faculty and students in pursuit of their critical mission to catalyze scientific inquiry and collective action to restore and protect the water quality, wildlife, and quality of life of the Narragansett Bay region, which of course is a strong focus of today's conversations. The purpose of today's event is to inspire greater awareness of the biodiversity that exists in the Narragansett Bay region, notwithstanding our expansive urban centers and dense human populations. A secondary goal is to convene biodiversity practitioners across political, organizational, and disciplinary boundaries to promote better application of biodiversity knowledge for research, education, and conservation. This focus on wildlife research, education, and conservation in the Narragansett Bay region aligns with Roger Williams University's institutional commitment to sustainability and academic excellence in the areas of marine biology, environmental science, and solutions-based interdisciplinary inquiry focused on the region's emerging blue economy. I look forward to learning with all of you here today about the wild things in our region and what we can do to help conserve them into the future. So again, welcome, and it's my pleasure now to hand it back to Darcy Young, and thanks to her and all of her colleagues at the Estuary Program for all their hard work on preparing for today. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Margaret, for that welcome, and to Roger Williams University for hosting us, especially the awesome event staff who made this event happen today. Before we get started with our program, I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about what we do at the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. So we're one of 28 congressionally designated national estuary programs around the United States, working to restore and protect estuaries of national significance. Narragansett Bay was actually one of the first 6 estuaries named in the 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act that established federal funding for the National Estuary Program. You'll hear me call National Estuary Programs NEPs. If you hear that acronym, that's what it means. All 28 of us differ a lot in how we operate. Some of us are small, like Narragansett Bay. Some of us are very big. The West Coast NEPs tend to be very big. Some of us are nonprofits, some of us are part of state agencies, some of us are independent institutions. So we're very variable, but we do also have a lot in common with each other. We're all voluntary and non-regulatory, and we're place-based programs that are governed by regional partnerships that are representing diverse watershed stakeholders. At least that's the goal. The National Estuary Program receives regular appropriations from Congress, and for the next several years, will also receive additional funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Big or small, each National Estuary Program works to be a catalyst for resource stewardship in estuaries and their watersheds. And by at least one metric, we're successful in that effort. We leverage about $22 for every $1 of federal funding that we receive. So, as the Narragansett Bay Region's National Estuary Program, we serve Narragansett Bay, Little Narragansett Bay, the Rhode Island coastal ponds, and their watersheds in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So we're actually a tri-state program, just by a hair. We've got about 4% of our watershed area is actually in Connecticut. So that's an area over 2,000 square miles. That's home to over 200 million, or I'm sorry, 2 million, not 200 million, 2 million people living in 113 different towns. So at the Estuary Program, we're currently a small but mighty staff of 3. My colleagues here with me today are Dr. Courtney Schmidt, who is NBEP's staff scientist, hi Courtney, and Mary L. Sorleen, who is NBEP's geospatial and design manager. We also fund internships for undergraduate and graduate students to work on projects with us and with our partners. We're governed by and energized by a 50-member partnership, including our steering committee, executive committee, and science advisory committee. Does that look better to folks, presentation-wise? Yeah? Okay, great, thanks for and Roger Williams University is not only our host for this event, the university, as Margaret said, has been NBEP's organizational and fiscal host for the past 2 years. And without that strong partnership from Roger Williams University, we'd be a lot less effective in our work. And what is that work? We strive to be a catalyst for scientific inquiry and collective action to restore and protect Narragansett Bay Region's water quality, wildlife, and quality of life. As a catalyst, though, we rarely do the work ourselves. Remember, there's only 3 of us as staff. Rather, we lean into providing services and funding to our partners to support them in doing their work. We're a regional convener and coordinator, a synthesizer and communicator of science, and a grant maker. For the past few years, we've awarded over 75% of our budget, totaling over $3 million to external partners. We specialize in funding pre-construction steps like stakeholder engagement, planning, and design, with an eye to creating a portfolio of shovel-ready projects that are ready for the historic amounts of federal funding becoming available for watershed restoration and resilience. We're also really proud to support critically needed capacity building within our partner organizations to hire new staff and enable existing talented staff to dedicate more time to building relationships, writing grants, and advancing projects. So in all of our work, we seek to fill gaps, be responsive, and provide actionable, useful information by tackling some of the region's most complex challenges. So we're here today to talk about biodiversity conservation. That topic intersects many of those challenging issues, from climate change to the just transition to clean energy, to housing affordability, urbanization, and environmental injustice. So today, in addition to acknowledging these challenges, we want to highlight the opportunities in our estuaries, rivers, and watersheds to work with nature to address these and other challenges. Biodiversity is at the heart of nature-based solutions that address societal challenges through the protection, sustainable management, and restoration of natural and modified ecosystems. And that benefits both biodiversity and human well-being. So biodiversity is not only an outcome of these successful nature-based solutions that we're trying to implement across the watershed, it's also a necessary building block of those solutions. So today, we've invited speakers and tablers who are undeniably passionate about their subjects in the hopes that they will inspire all of us to make a difference for wildlife and wildlands, no matter our ages, educational backgrounds, or professions. You'll learn about common backyard species, as well as some species you've probably never seen or heard of. We'll keep you fed, hydrated, caffeinated, and hopefully entertained throughout the day. During breaks, please say hello to the friendly tablers who are set up just outside. And when you head to the restrooms, which are down the hall to your left as you exit the room past the registration table, please stop and take a look at the event's art installation called Tipping Points, brought to us today by Susan Israel with Climate Creators. We'll have a few minutes for questions following each speaker's presentation. So we'll use Mentimeter, or you could call it Menti, software to collect questions from the audience, and then we'll invite each speaker to choose their favorite question from what's up on the screen. So I want to bring up Mentimeter. I saw that many of you have already logged in and started providing answers, which is great. But for folks who haven't used Mentimeter before, here's a quick tutorial. So if you have a device with you today, a phone, a tablet, a laptop, any of those things will work. You'll want to type into your favorite browser, menti.com, menti.com. And then when you get there, you can enter the code that's there on the screen. Or if you're tech savvy, you can use that QR code that's up there too. So you should see the first question about wild things popping up for you. And let me just flip to the next slide for a second. If you lose your login and you have to get back in, it's always going to be up there at the top of the screen, menti.com, and then with the code. So you can always get back in if you happen to get kicked out. So as each presenter comes up to the stage, I'll open their Q&A on Menti. That means that you can enter questions as the speaker is talking. You don't have to try to remember your questions throughout the whole talk. And you can submit as many questions as you like for each presenter. And when that presenter is done, I'll bring that Menti slide back up and we'll be able to see all of the questions that have been submitted. And at the end of the day today, if we stay on time and leave a few minutes for discussion, we'll be able to open up the microphone to the audience for verbal comments and questions as well. So I want to say, if you don't have a device with you today, or if you're having trouble accessing Menti, or you just don't want to use it, please come find me, Courtney, or Marielle, and we'll help you find an alternative so that you can get your questions in as well. And with that, thank you very much for being here, and I can't wait to hear from all of our presenters. So first, I'd like to call up Dr. David Gregg to the podium, and I'll read David's bio. David is the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, an amateur naturalist since childhood with particular interest in insects. By training, David is an archaeologist and museum curator who holds a PhD in anthropology from Brown University. Prior to coming to the Natural History Survey, David directed the Spellman Museum of Stamps in Weston, Massachusetts, and was a curator at Brown University's Hackenrefer Museum. Did I get that right? Yeah. David has published on archaeology, museums, and conservation, and hosts documentary videos on the survey's YouTube channel. He's a senior fellow of the Coastal Institute at URI, a board member of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Memorial Association, and on the collection committee of the Rhode Island Historical Society.
Well, thank you very much to Darcy and Courtney and the rest of the staff of the Estuary Program, and to our hosts at Roger Williams University. It's kind of fun to sit here and look at the word cloud and try to guess who put up which headings. I put up wandering glider just to make you think it was ginger. And there aren't very many plants there, so the botanists need to kind of get on that. Plants can be wild too. We're gonna hear today 15 or so talks and look at exhibits on all kinds of biodiversity, from coyotes to mushrooms, herring to salt marshes and turtles. So I have to try to put a frame around essentially what could be a chaos of animals and plants, and try to talk a little bit about why we've chosen biodiversity as a topic for us all to speak to today. But for a lot of people, biodiversity is a concept that's abstract, and it sort of stands for that good feeling we have when we go to a special place. You get out of your car and you're like, wow, or you go through that wood line into the trees, or you launch your canoe into a really amazing place. It's kind of like pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And for a lot of people, it's not a lot more complicated than that, and that's sort of satisfactory. You think, there must be a lot of species here, or wow, look at all the different niches that are together, or I've got a really good chance of finding a rare species here. I know that, a lot of us, we're in this business to find rare species and become famous for finding some really cool thing. And of course, rare species are that long tail to the right in the species accumulation curve, where you really add a lot of numbers and you get biodiversity. So it's definitely about species at some level. And when people talk about species biodiversity, a lot of times they're talking about rare species and particular species, charismatic or what have you. But there are other kinds of biodiversity. Ecologists also talk about community biodiversity, and that's where there are a lot of essentially niches or natural communities that are in close proximity to each other. And both species biodiversity and community biodiversity are understood within a spatial extent. So they sort of reference an area within which you have a large number of species or natural communities. But you can also have population biodiversity, which really references the genetic diversity that you have when you have a lot of individuals of one species in a population. And a population can have very large or small extent. Think box turtles on one end, let's say, and wandering gliders on the other, which could possibly have a global population. But no matter how you slice it or dice it, biodiversity is about species and populations of species. No matter how you slice it or dice it, biodiversity is about things you see out there in the field with binoculars and hats and boots, us, not the turtles. And no matter where you fall on the spectrum between lumpers and splitters, at some level, species are something you observe out there that have some characteristics that you've observed. And they are different than something else you observed out there that doesn't have those characteristics, or has slightly less of whatever it is that the characteristic is that you're looking at. And also, concretely, when we're talking about biodiversity and conserving biodiversity, we're talking about looking at biodiversity with sort of 4 characteristics. So it's who, what, when, where characteristics. And you can kind of sum it up as species and natural communities in space and time, or there was a marbled salamander in my backyard on Thursday. Bob saw a marbled salamander in his backyard on Thursday. Who, what, when, where. And you could also perhaps add, and it was looking fat and happy. Or, and I see it and others there all the time. And these are all what I think of as essential to, an essential component of thinking about biodiversity that's sort of different than some of the other ways that we do ecology or natural history. And so you could, somebody saw a manatee in Quaney Pond in September of 2023, or there were terrapin hatchlings in Barrington in August of 2014, or there was kudzu in Charlestown in July of 2020, and I don't know if anybody's been to look at the patch lately. I don't know whether it's already in Westerly and Richmond or not, but and you can, if you do it for long, if you pile it up long enough, you can get historical trends, you can get distributions and changes in distributions. So there were rattlesnakes in Tiverton in August of 1966, and that'll be the last record that we have of those in whatever this database is that we're talking about here. So this whole idea of finding things out there, identifying them, and putting them down with these sort of 4 characteristics is kind of elemental to the original founding of the Natural History Survey. So the Natural History Survey is a 501c3 nonprofit. We were founded in 1994 by a bunch of folks, about half of them with a URI association, but the other half from all over the state, And one of the first things we did was to make a lot of, to start some projects to enumerate species in Rhode Island and make some checklists, which we published in books. And we also held conferences. And it's actually kind of fun for Kyra and I to be at a conference on biodiversity that we didn't organize, because then we just get to visit the people instead of fret about whether or not the lights and the microphone work. So really, it's really a joy to be here for that reason too. In 2002, the Natural History Survey took over the operation of Rhode Island's rare species database. And we have been managing it in cooperation with 3 partners, URI, DDM, and Nature Conservancy, ever since. Again, this is essentially a record of, well, first of all, you make a list of the species that are likely to be extirpated sometime in the near future if things don't change, and you record those species in space and time. And we're currently in the process, thanks to support from the Estuary Program, we're in the process of developing a follow-on to that original database, which is going to be become familiar, hopefully, to lots of people. This is Forest 2, the Biota of Rhode Island Information System. And again, it's an index to records of who, what, when, where, and how do we know. Kind of the elements of biodiversity as I'm sort of describing it here. It's also sort of the elements of natural history as I've come to try to articulate it at the Natural History Survey when people ask me, what's a natural history survey? Natural history is something that you do with respect to animals and plants in their natural communities, not in laboratory conditions or ex situ. And we sort of describe natural history values as being study living organisms in their natural habitat, study things nearby to learn about the world, and with appropriate support, any curious observer can contribute. Now, for conserving biodiversity, for conserving species out there, there are a variety of tools in our toolbox, whose stated purpose is the conservation of biodiversity or ecosystem health. But a lot of those tools don't target species per se. There's a lot of important conservation that's not directed at biodiversity, but at target factors that research has shown are related to broad ecological health and ultimately to biodiversity. For example, stormwater diversion or retention basins and things like that, built out of concrete, denitrifying septic systems, personal favorite, smokestack scrubbers. But I think it's fair to say that these are not what the public understands as conserving biodiversity. Nobody says, hey honey, it's a nice evening, let's go down to the river and look at the chloride ions. You almost never see this. So attention to things that aren't animals and plants is warranted only to the extent that we're confident in the associations that have been established between the chloride ions and the animals, plants, and rich places that we're really in this for. And so there's a whole suite of tools that another suite of tools we have that are more directly reference biodiversity in one way or another. So we'll talk a little bit about the natural heritage methodology. And I think about this as a methodology. You want to stop biodiversity from declining in Rhode Island. You make a list of the species that are potentially on their way out. You map locations where they perform some essential part of their life cycle, and then you institute policies and you direct resources towards saving those places. And this works really great for things that have really well-defined locations, like bats that have hibernacula, put on a map. orchids and other plants that don't move around very much that you can go right to, heron rookeries, things that can be spots on maps. That doesn't work super great on bobcats, let's say, which have a 60 square mile home range. You're not going to say, oh, this is the bobcat's place, let's save the whole thing. And that's why we have the Wildlife Action Plan. So the Wildlife Action Plan uses a basket of species to identify key habitats and threats to those habitats, and then you implement various conservation activities to try to save those key habitats. And this works better for things that have a kind of that aren't as easily put on, indicated as a spot on the map. Like, it's good for grassland birds or things like box turtles, which occur widely but unpredictably in the right habitats. And we also have the mitigation of stressors. This is kind of in our toolbox. If you think about fishing bycatch and all of the different ways that we try to implement to reduce fishing bycatch, different things that we do to try to stop poaching of herps, for instance, and even the Christmas greens law is essentially, and it's an implementation of something to reduce a stressor on populations of rare plants. And there's another tool that's become quite fashionable these days, and that is we're in climate change. So there's an argument that with climate change, all the animals and plants are going to change. So there's not these methods that actually focus on the animals and plants maybe aren't as good as focusing on geomorphological and hydrological features. And so it's sort of the save the stage argument, where places with high biodiversity now are going to have high biodiversity in the future. It might be different, but we're just going to save the stage. And this is sort of expressed in these ecological land units, which there are maps of, and they are essentially looking at aspects of geophysical setting to identify places that are likely to have high biodiversity in the future. The thing is, the very argument of the ELUs is that climate change is going to scramble the deck, it's going to shuffle the deck. And I think the problem is that, remember, our tools that look indirectly at saving biodiversity are only useful to the extent that we're confident in the associations between whatever the things are that we're looking at and the biodiversity, whatever those factors are and the biodiversity that results from them. And models are simplifications. They're based on data that's already been collected, so they're essentially backwards looking. And when you simplify things, you might not get the full impact of something like climate change, which is, it's not just things are going to get warmer, it's absolutely novel. Nobody has ever gathered data in the conditions that we're going to have here in the future. And so, to some extent, you have to ask what the limits are on guiding our conservation strictly through models, however sophisticated they may be. One of the things that we have been trained to do is to look at a distribution of data like this and to focus on whatever the sort of center of gravity is of our data distribution. And this is the answer. This is 4.3 and 8. That's the answer. And we try really hard to get rid of all these other things, like something's wrong with this one, and I don't know why we got those, but that's noise. There's no information there. And I've been really interested in a concept called positive deviance. It's something that comes to us from social science, and it actually is designed to look at how social systems adapt to change. Because the future conditions for some of those systems come not from the people or the systems that now reside in the norm or in the median. They come from the outliers. And we know this from ecology, from adaptation. The center of future distributions of species viability are going to come out of outliers that for some reason we don't understand are they have a special trick they do or some genetic capacity or behavioral aspect to them that's going to allow them to adapt to future climate conditions. And so there's a lot of information in these outliers. And what I think we need to do is to ask ourselves why they're outliers and what do they have to tell us. And again, this comes back to getting away from our desks, out the door, and looking at stuff and really being open to seeing things that you didn't expect to see. Yeah, I know that this bird lives in wetlands, but you found it in a shrubland. And so we have to ask ourselves, first of all, we have to record that fact. We have to ask ourselves what it means. Because in time of climate change, the future animals and plants are going to come out of very, very small founder populations and move to new areas. Or they're going to be populations that are released from bottlenecks, so very small populations. And so there's going to be really different sort of centers of gravity to the distributions of data in the future. And we have to be kind of open to that. So it's very easy, the other thing is that it's very easy to, again, use the simplification that comes from, for very good reasons, and I tried to identify the key factor to, let's say, biodiversity decline. We try to hone in on that one thing. It's very expensive to fix everything, let's say. So we can convince funders to fund our research because whatever we're able to identify as the key thing, that'll be much less expensive to fix that one key thing than to sort of fix a whole bunch of things. But we can get a little bit drawn off by that. And we sort of tend to forget where we are and what we're trying to do. So, you can say for public, to get the public excited that you want the river to be fishable and swimmable, but you can swim in a swimming pool and you can fish in an aquarium. So you've sort of lost track of that, the public's understanding of biodiversity. It's a cool thing that you essentially feel when you get out of the car. You're out there. And as my childhood hero, Buckaroo Banzai, said, you can take this mountain, and you can model it. You can sift through the outputs like breadcrumbs for the rest of your natural life, and you will never, ever find one of these. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, David. I forgot to advance the Menti slide for you all. I think we managed to do it halfway through. We have 3 questions here, but if anyone had a burning question you weren't able to get into Menti, please feel free to raise your hand as well. But David, if you want to just take a look at those or on the screen, go for it.
So the Christmas Greens law was a response to people going, basically parking their car on a roadside and going out into woods that didn't appear to belong to anybody and taking winterberry, birch branches, lycopodium, and stuff like that. And it was really impacting the plants at some sites where people were really gathering a lot of people were gathering things. I don't think Etsy existed when they created the Christmas Greens law, but if if it did, you'd probably have people taking things from the wild and putting them into wreaths and selling them on Etsy. So that's the Christmas greens law, and it's been very effective. Do planted natives count for biodiversity surveys? We haven't really addressed the question of essentially artificial or restoration populations very well in Rhode Island. I actually think there's a conversation, I don't know how you do it in Massachusetts, but I think there's a conversation, well, I know there's a conversation to be had with DEM and with other folks involved in conservation in Rhode Island to try to figure out what the status of these reintroduced populations are, and also of populations of rare plants that are planted. I mean, Asclepias tuberosa orange milkweed is the example that everybody always gives. That it's listed as state concern, and we are tracking wild populations on a map, but it's really common in gardens. So that's a really good question, and I don't know what the answer is to it. What is BioBlitz? BioBlitz is an effort by volunteers to count as many animals and plants as they can in 24 hours on a certain piece of land. And Rhode Island Natural History Survey organized the first Rhode Island BioBlitz in 2000. It was only a couple of years after the founding of the invention of BioBlitz by Sam Droege and E.O. Wilson. And we've had a BioBlitz in Rhode Island every year since. Next year will be the 25th Rhode Island BioBlitz, and I'd like somebody to prove that it's not the oldest, longest running BioBlitz in the world. I think it is. You'd have to have started before us and not missed a single one. This year, it's almost always held in June. It'll be the second weekend in June coming up. We have not announced the location, but everybody will be very excited about it. Last year's was on the Narragansett Indian Reservation in Charlestown, and it was really cool. I know a lot of people here were at that event. How do you address full biodiversity when people focus on charismatic megafauna? Well, I mean, I think that would be sort of the idea of an indicator species or a keystone species that you can get people excited about and engage them in. And we have it in our power to affect the public's understanding of what that kind of indicator or that marquee species is. I think probably we could have more influence in picking species that are really good indicators that are going to direct attention and resources towards things that we have evaluated as needing a lot of help. So our non-native species reported differently. We get this question when you're databasing biodiversity by sort of indexing biodiversity in these sort of who, what, when, where ways. People ask about data quality, and they also ask about non-native species. And I actually think, when you're trying to just find a species in space and time, it works great for rare species, and it works great for invasive species, because that's just exactly the same information you need, especially for early detection species. And so essentially the tool you have for one is great for the tool for the other. And I would argue that we don't know what this stuff is going to be good for, but computers don't care much about how many things you ask them to remember. It's just a few more electrons. And so I really think that we should try and index as much data as we can. And then we'll let the future researchers and naturalists figure it out. You always start monitoring too late. So when you have an existing data set that has some time depth, that's really special. Is that out of time? Nope. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, David. Now I'm going to advance the slide first this time, so I remember to do it. All right. So next up is our keynote speaker, Dr. John Waldman. John joined the faculty of Queens College as a tenured professor of biology in 2004. For the previous 20 years, he was employed by the Hudson River Foundation for Science and Environmental Research. He received his PhD in 1986 from the Joint Program in Evolutionary Biology between the American Museum of Natural History and the City University of New York. His research interests focus on the historical ecology of rivers and the restoration of diadromous fishes. John has authored more than 100 scientific articles, numerous essays in the New York Times, Yale Environment 360, and other outlets, and several popular books, including Running Silver, Restoring Atlantic Rivers, and Their Great Fish Migrations. Welcome up to the stage, John.
And thanks so much for inviting me. Great. I love this old photo. It shows a man of 87 years in 1895 posing with 4 very beautiful striped bass he caught. I don't know where it was actually shot, but it just has a great flavor. And based on the tackle, I'm sure these fish were from salt water. And they were, of course, because striped bass are anadromous, born in freshwater. Right there you see the two working together to provide great satisfaction. So the diadromous fishes, and this includes the anadromous fish that's born in freshwater and go to the sea, and the catadromous fish, which do the reverse of that, the eel. These are the ones you could possibly find along the Rhode Island coast, but and the northeast of the U.S. has a very high number of these kinds of fish compared to other parts of the world. But the ones I circled are the ones that are most relevant to Rhode Island. I think that the striped bass, of course, is cod here in this state, the place where these fish spend post-spawning period feeding before they winter over. And then we have the river herring, blueback herring, and alewife, 2 lower ones. And they are a fish that can be really numerous in Rhode Island waters, even though Rhode Island does not generally have large freshwater rivers. These fish thrive in smaller ones, and they are really important bait fish for the marine world. Then we have shad, which exist in low numbers in the state, but I think they are to be viewed as a target species that you could have more of, and they are really wonderful species in many ways. So there are about 200 anadromous fish species in the world, and there are about 20,000 fish species in total. So they are not a large part of the world's fish fauna, but they are, when they are allowed to thrive, they can be incredibly beneficial and exist in huge numbers. So I love this particular postcard, which I found in an antique shop in Cape Cod some years ago, and it shows the Herring River in Cape Cod. And if you know Cape Cod, every other river is named either the Herring River or the Mill River, which are the 2 major uses for their small streams. And I think it's from the 30s, possibly the 40s. And you see here a shed full of barrels, a part of the stream that's been straightened to allow the fish to get up here quickly, and a pond for seining, and then a pond for spawning. This is for alewives. And it shows really, I think, in a kind of visual metaphor, the promise and perils for these fish. They are valuable, and if you wanted to find them, those same individuals in October or December, you could put 100 ships out at sea with large nets, let them fish day and night and not catch one. But if you know from past experience the history of these fish, you know that from, let's say, March 20th or March 28th or whatever, on average, they will come marching into your laps, literally. And you have total control over them. So you have this great promise if you manage them correctly, but you have the great peril if you're having too much control over them. So I researched this and found that this creek produced 400 barrels of alewives a year. And by allowing enough of them to go into the spawning pond, you can have a major fishery forever. But if you're stupid and you get greedy and you don't let enough of them or any of them get up there, the whole thing crashes. And this is the visual metaphor for what we've done to our rivers in general. It's the same thing on a micro scale. So in researching my book, I was very interested in some of the quotes by colonists who came here, because they were coming from continents, in the case of Europe, where fish had been overfished for centuries, land had been over-timbered. They weren't used to anything resembling pristine conditions. So I found many wonderful quotes, but these are 3 that I really enjoyed. One is that the alewives came in such multitudes as it's almost incredible. Another one that when the water is not knee-deep, they will press up through your hands. Yea, though you beat at them with cudgels and in such abundance, that's incredible. And my absolute all-time favorite, by William Byrd from the Natural History of Virginia, in a word, it is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, it's also incomprehensible what quantity is found there. One must behold oneself. I don't know how many he saw, but he was overwhelmed with what he saw. And, these are abundances that we can only barely imagine these days. The river herring have not fared well, the alewife and blueback. If you look at the shaded area, it shows the decline from 1950 to a few years ago, and you can see that it's pretty drastic. They were referred to as passenger pigeons of the sea because they were so numerous. The passenger pigeon was the most abundant bird in North America, maybe in the world. And you know what happened to them? Has any of you seen a passenger pigeon? Maybe. I don't think so. So along the northeast corridor, we see that there are total closures. In some states, Rhode Island has a total closure, and they're not faring very well. And one character who I didn't expect to be important in my book, but which I found to be really foresightful in what he was seeing as he spent time on rivers. He made a trip with his brother on the Concord and Merrimack rivers, and he's most famous for a certain book about a certain pond. But this is actually a book well worth reading, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And he made the trip in 1839, self-published in 1849. And as he's traveling on the Concord and Merrimack, as these rivers have been commodified for human use, he is appalled at the future of these fish. He has quote after quote, section after section about what he foresaw for the fate of these fish. And my favorite quote was one that was incredibly plaintive: "Who hears the fishes when they cry?" Amazing. And he was so against the grain then when people were excited about the Industrial Revolution and were just basically destroying the ecology of these rivers. So this is the Merrimack and in Manchester, and you can see that the river has just been straightened, and they're capturing all the power they can to drive these incredibly huge mills that were sometimes a football field long. It became a major industrial hub because of the river, and then it was sort of left behind. The first dam there is the Amaskia Dam, which in the Native American dialect means a great fishing place. And you can see people, and you can go to this visitor center there, and you can celebrate the magic of the Merrimack. How are you going to celebrate that? You go to this fish viewing window on the lower right, and you're going to see green water and almost never see a fish. Just very few ever make it that far. On the left, you see the fish ladder that theoretically brings them past the window to the next reservoir, but they pass anywhere from few to none per year. The only fish you see some years is that fiberglass model. What's changed over time? Well, fish size has changed, surprisingly. We don't see as many large individuals as we used to, and this is particularly apparent with shad on the lower left. In John McPhee's book, The Founding Fish, which is a great read about the importance of shad to America in the early days, he said that shad packed 40 to the barrel in the year 1800 and 100 to the same size barrel in 1900. There was a drastic change in size. And you can see with this postcard on the lower left, these shad are huge. And any one of these would win a fishing derby on any of the major rivers that we have for shad every year. But we don't see fish of that size anymore. So something is going on there. I think there's possibly a few reasons for that. I worked with a colleague to look at the status of these fish quantitatively. We published a paper in Bioscience in 2009. And we looked at both the American shore and the European shore. And we found that there were 22 species in one or the other or both that we could cover, and that American shad had lost half of their populations, mainly because of dams, and a third of North American Atlantic salmon populations were extirpated. And this was the major payoff analysis here. You see on the Northeast Atlantic, the European shore, Northwest Atlantic, the American shore. In almost every case, you have a vast decline. And these are standardized, so they're comparable. Vast decline. Atlantic sturgeon, look at that. It went from a very high number to almost zero in a couple of years because of a caviar craze around the world, where people just overfish them like mad. Shad are way down. Everything is down except for striped bass. It's the one exception of any importance. And the reason for that is that it had only one driver that was really bringing it down, and that was overfishing. Once overfishing was relieved, that population came back again. The other species all have multiple drivers and multiple problems, of course. And when you looked at 31 time series, we found that there were 98% declines from historic highs in 13 of them, and 90% in an additional 11. So the track record on this is appalling, basically. Looked at some case histories, and salmon are sad to think about. A friend of mine who works for the Atlantic Salmon Federation says that they estimate that in American waters there were up to 500,000 fish coming in annually, mostly in Maine, but also as far down as the Housatonic River in Connecticut. In 2014, there were fewer than 400, and in 2022, it had risen to about 1,500. So we're not doing well there. My colleague, Carolyn Lindbergh, looked at the interior penetration of these fish inland, in the case of shad, and found that they had lost about 40% of their river habitat. Of course, it's going to have a profound effect. And one case history that I enjoyed following was the case of Susquehanna River shad. On the upper left, you see the Susquehanna River where it's flowing out of Lake Otsego in central New York. And on the lower left, you can see the upper arrow shows Lake Otsego. So those fish that entered at the lower part of the map, which is the upper part of Chesapeake Bay, had roughly a 400-mile trip to get to that area. And they spawned in other locations along the way. And I think there were actually tens of millions of individuals based on some inferences. And they were a huge part of the local economy and culture. They were so important that in the lower arrow, it's the area around Scranton, where one fishery actually posted a person on a hill with a spyglass to look for bulges in the water as the schools came up. Can you imagine that quantity that would actually change the nature of the river? And further down at Havre de Grace, at the top of the bay, there was a very, very large fishery that used an enormous net, and they set it once, and a northwest wind blew up, and it took 3 days to land the net. And at the end of 3 days, it took several days to unload the net because they caught 15 million shad and river herring. And these fish, as I said, were important regionally. You see in the upper right a shad bake, which was a major spring event on many major shad rivers, including on the Hudson, where I done a lot of work. And I went to one shad bake once, and then after that, they stopped happening, and they used steelhead trout as a substitute. So that was sad. Anyway, a shad bake basically involved taking shad fillets and putting bacon strips across them, roasting them on an open fire. Some people say you would throw away the shad and make a plank, but actually shad are quite delicious, and in fact, their Latin name, Pilosus apodicima, means most delicious of herrings. So this is what's going on with shad these days in the Susquehanna. The 4 lowermost dams from York Haven down to Conowingo were built in the early 1900s, and they were built without any kind of fish passage. And then they had retrofitted fish ladders and fish elevators. And the one thing about having hydropower and these kinds of engineered facilities is that you get to count every fish that comes over the dam. You can't do in a wild river. So the goal is to get 750,000 past the York Haven Dam spawn. That's an order of magnitude less than was there in the old days. So this is not ambitious in that sense. But we know that, for instance, in 2014, 10,000 made it past the Conowingo at the bottom, 2,500 past Holtwood, 1,300 past Safe Harbor, and 8 fish made it past York Haven. Try to bulge the water with fish coming upriver. And that's not atypical. Some years it's 0, some years it's 100. It just wavers around close to nothingness. So this brings up a broader issue that applies to many species, including some of those that we spoke about. The shifting baseline syndrome. It's a pervasive problem. It involves faded memories and a loss of salience of species to society. And it was popularized by Daniel Pauly, who actually was invited to fill up the last page of a journal. His colleague had 1 page left. And he had been thinking about this for a while, and he wrote a 1-pager about this, and it became one of the most widely cited papers in all of conservation biology. So Pauly wrote that each generation of fishery scientists accepts as a baseline the stock size that occurred at the beginning of their careers, uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks have further declined, but it is the stocks at that time that serve as a new baseline. So it's kind of an insidious ratchet. I think that's a good term for it. And it's been called other terms too, intergenerational memory loss and so on. But basically, the average person today has no clue what they've lost. In the case of these fish and so many others. Here's a graphic example of that I find pretty amazing. So this is shad landings of the Potomac, which is one of the two great shad rivers along with the Susquehanna. And in 1887, it produced a huge number of fish by today's comparisons, up around 8 million kilograms in a season. And you can see that over time, that went down and down and down with some noise, down to almost nothing in the year 2000. Now, fix your eyes on 1887, and let's go further back in time. There's 1887. There's 1814. Many, many, many times that. So going back in time and actually understanding your system, this is called historical ecology, becoming a major, I think, part of conservation. And it's not so much that it allows you to then, okay, recreate a system that's going to give you 50 million kilograms per year. That's not going to happen. We've had too much change. But it does help to inspire. The inspiration is incredibly important in actually affecting change. What can be done about this? Well, I wrote a paper recently for Science Advances about the drivers of change and broke them up into these categories. We have what's largely rectified, which is pollution. Because of the Clean Water Act, our rivers are a heck of a lot healthier than they were prior to that in 1972. But I think pollution is terribly overrated as a factor. We had way more shad in the Hudson River back in its polluted days than we do today in its clean waters. And I just don't think it's a big factor, except in extreme cases. Then we have that which are tractable and mostly applied. And one of them is overfishing. And we still have overfishing. We're probably overfishing our striped bass right now. But we've reined it in to a large degree. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission does a pretty good job about reducing overfishing, and I think that's much less of a factor. Power plants in some systems have been a big factor. Power plants in the Hudson suck in huge amounts of fresh water to cool the generators, and along the way they kill literally billions of eggs and larvae of fish. But they're going to be changing over time as they attrition out to closed cycle cooling, and that would be less of a factor. Then we have essentially untractable, non-native species. I think this is an underestimated effect. In the case of the Hudson, we have the zebra mussels that came in the early 90s that changed the ecology of the river. And the thing about these invasions is that they're there to stay. You can't reverse them. Then we have climate, and climate is affecting change. We're seeing change on these fish. And it's theoretically tractable, but who among us believes we're going to actually reduce CO2 levels in the atmosphere anytime soon? So that leaves us one driver that's tractable but still unrectified, and that's dams. There's a riddle. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Oh, dam. This is the Conowingo Dam, the first one in the Susquehanna, and some of them are huge. How do fish theoretically pass dams? Well, we have fish ladders, most of you have seen. And the thing about a fish ladder is that I think when the general public sees one of these, they think, okay, dam, but fixed because you have a ladder. They don't work well. They don't work well. Some of them work well for river herring, but larger fish don't like to use them. Sturgeon and shad are never found in them, and sturgeon and striped bass are never found in them, and shad depends on the ladder, but they generally have a poor track record. Then we have fish elevators, which is a strange term to connect to the word fish elevator, but they are for dams that are so large, so high that the fish ladder can't possibly work. The fish get lifted up to the reservoir level and then released into the reservoir where they don't know what the current is and they spend time being lost. And then we have something that is downright pathetic. It's migration via the internal combustion engine, where these fish are herded into a truck and taken upriver to their spawning grounds. And as a friend of mine said, they come out of the dark tank and say, what just happened? Well, we're here, we might as well spawn. And the funny thing is it actually can work better because they get the pain over within an hour instead of trying to spend weeks working their way through several ladders and elevators. But it's still, again, kind of sad. So colleagues and I wrote a paper about the success of fish ways on northeastern rivers. And we looked at the Merrimack, the Connecticut, and the Susquehanna. And these were the number passed of shad as a percent of the targets. And the targets are, I think, very low compared to what was in the rivers originally. But you can see that other than a brief flash of success in the Merrimack, it's been dismal. And if you look at the passage efficiencies for shad in these same rivers now, looking now at how many passed the first dam to make it past the final dam. You can count them because they're hydro dams. And you can see that looking at the red lines, Merrimack has nothing to be proud of. And the Connecticut River also wobbled at minute levels over time. So it's simply not working. Fish passage engineers have had 50 years to make this work. Not work, they still fiddle, they still tweak, they make them a little better, but they're not the answer. The track record shows that they're simply not the answer. What is the answer? The answer is dam removal. In my opinion, the great precedent on the East Coast was the removal of Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River. It was built in 1837. Produced only 3.5 megawatts of power, where John McPhee said enough to support the LL Bean warehouse and not much else. And it did not have a ladder on it, downtown Augusta. And it was opened up, and it provided 17 more miles of main stem river for these fish to use. So you can see it being breached there. So for 162 years, I think it was, river herring could not reach the Sebasticook River, which physically and ecologically is like a Shangri-La for the species. So once they could access it, that population went from 0 when they couldn't reach it to almost 6 million in a matter of a few years. It became a very popular site for both eagles, of which I think more than 50 go there every spring to snatch herring, and also for lobster fishermen who come there for bait, which can be very scarce at times. And it became so popular they actually started a alewife festival. So what can be done? We need to free rivers in space and time. On the left, you see some engineering diagrams of the couple of rivers in Maine, and the fish don't have a chance. Look at that, it's like railroad tracks, railroad ties. And the fish, there's so few of them, they may not find each other at the right time of the season. Then they have to surmount dam after dam after dam, and they usually don't have a chance to come back to the sea and spawn again. So they're one-time spawners, so we waste all their future productivity. In a healthy river, you have none of that. They come when they want to, they can utilize different sections of the river, and they can spawn over and over again. So going back to the Kennebec for a second, something really interesting happened this spring I want to share with you. I was in Maine fly fishing that week, and I missed seeing this, but huge numbers of Atlantic sturgeon entered Cobbessy Stream in downtown Gardner. And these are being viewed from a bridge over this stream, which is basically a trout stream-sized bridge. And there was, according to a biologist friend of mine, as many as 200 of these giant sturgeon at once, up to 8 or 10 feet long, spawning right there in 3 feet of water. And this just shows you, again, if you can take care of these fish and take care of the system they live in, you can have some remarkable surprises. So let's talk about Rhode Island for a second. Rhode Island has over 500 dams in the small state. This is just the dams in 2 watersheds, and it's almost like it was hit with several shotgun blasts. There's just dams everywhere, and a lot of these serve no purpose any longer. And the gem in this whole area, I think, is the Blackstone. I had a chance to tour it with John Marsland some years ago, and this river had 39 dams at one point, considered the hardest working river in America. It was the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Down to 19 now, which is no number to be proud of. That's still an amazingly high number. And it's a decent-sized river that has terrific potential for both shad and probably a few salmon and certainly river herring. I know people are fighting hard for it. People are fighting against it. But I I urge you all to think about supporting this endeavor because this would do wonders for the regional fish populations. I want to finish up by asking you, why did the fish cross the road? And the answer is to spawn. This is a very famous image of chum salmon in the Northwest crossing a wet road to get to trying to get to the spawning region, trying to get further upriver. And, it kind of reminds me of the mantra from the Field of Dreams, the movie, if you build it, they will come. The reverse of that is if you take it down, they will come. So I'll stop there. Anadromous. Anadromous simply means spawned in fresh water and going to sea as a normal part of its life. So that would include many of the fish I mentioned, Pacific salmons and striped bass and so on. How does shifting baselines impact fishery restoration goals? Does a goal of 750,000 bass a dam seem too big? I think the answer here is to be ambitious. Why could you may not meet it, but why start with low goals? You're already down one order of magnitude. So it may be that you're miles away from that, but I wouldn't reduce the goal to, 30 fish. You want to have a high number so you actually inspire. Did the shad fall out of favor in 1824? I don't understand that question. What happened in 1824? What? The graph? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't think they fell out of favor. Dramatically back then because they were eaten for a very long time, but their numbers dwindled because of overfishing and other changes. They've also fallen very much out of favor. I mean, there's like a cult of people who love the first shad of the year along the whole East Coast, particularly for their roe. It's really esteemed. But, the average person, how many of you had shad this week? 2 out of 3 maybe. It used to be a big part of life. Oh, can you help us in the Blackstone? I'm hoping and helping you now by making a plea to, you got local people to be involved. I did write a book where I included several pages about the Blackstone, so I have done something to help the river, I think. Still very much need someone to help speak in this behalf. I'm happy to do that. What advice do you have for those advocating dam removals? Permitting processes take a while, lots of political opposition, long road to progress. Yeah, I'd say your advice is to stick with it. It's not easy. The physical removal of the dam is usually not that hard. It's the permitting, getting all the administrative ducks lined up in a row can take years and years and years, and then timing that to funding availability, it's a big problem. I have a graduate student who is now the habitat restoration person for Hudson River Keeper. His main focus is taking down dams, and he's been working there for several years. I think he's actually had 2 or 3 removed, and is working on several others. There are an estimated 1,400 in that system, so we got a long way to go. One thing about all of this that I think we should be thinking about too is the changing energy mix. Right now you have 5 wind turbines off Block Island, the only ones on the East Coast, I believe. There are plans for about 400. If we get anywhere near that, there's going to be a lot of new electricity that will allow us to lose hydropower from rivers more easily without taking a big hit in any kind of way. So I think we should be thinking proactively about that. Also, a lot of these dams, these are the oldest dams in the country. New England was settled first, and they're meant to last for roughly 100 years. Many of them have lasted twice that. They don't last forever, and you're reading lately about climate change storms causing dam failures around the country and around the world. They're going to have to come down anyway. So why don't we start thinking more about the safety aspect in conjunction with the ecological aspect? Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Who are the people doing the dam removal work locally, and how do I connect folks to that work?
I would say most rivers that have dams have a local grassroots organization that cares about the river, and this is item 1 or 2 on their agenda. So find out who, I know there's a Blackstone River group, there's probably groups for other major rivers around here, or even some minor rivers. So work on a granular level with them. Help fund them, help do river cleanups, help publicize. If money is being sought, write letters in support of it. You know, there are things you can do. You can also go there at night with some dynamite, but that's a little risky. Okay. Is poor water quality, dissolved oxygen in spawning ponds a problem in Rhode Island? I don't know for a fact. I would say probably not, because spawning occurs in the spring, or you get really hot weather that's going to make the DO levels drop a lot. I've never heard of it being a problem for Rhode Island. I don't see why it would be, except in maybe some special situations.
All right, thank you very much, John. And we will hear several other perspectives on fish passage today, including from local advocates. So those of you who are looking to get connected, please stay for the rest of the day. Right now, we're going to take a coffee break. Let's come back at about 10 o'clock. So welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started with our saltwater and coastal session. To kick us off, we have Dr. Conor McManus. And Conor serves as the chief for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management's Division of Marine Fisheries. He received his BA from Boston University and both his MS and PhD in oceanography from the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. His research has spanned over a variety of topics, including fisheries oceanography, population dynamics, estuarine ecology, and fisheries management. Much of his research has focused on how marine fish, invertebrates, and their habitats of the northeast U.S. continental shelf have responded to changes in climate, harvest, ecosystem dynamics, and anthropogenic stressors through time. Conor sits on innumerable committees, including NBEP's steering committee. Thanks, Conor.
Thanks for having me, and I apologize in advance for jumping around from fish to fish or fishery to fishery. The goal here is to kind of give you a quick snapshot of all that's going on in Rhode Island, and specifically Narragansett Bay, with regards to what's living in here and how they interact with our community. And so, in doing so, I wanted to give folks a quick background on, what commercial fisheries mean to Rhode Island and how valuable they are. Over time, we've seen relatively stable landings, but you can see both in terms of the simple ex-vessel value, what fish are bought for, as well as when you start thinking about all the businesses that are reliant on fisheries from ice manufacturers to boat manufacturers to gear manufacturers. Coastal fisheries for Rhode Island are incredibly important to the blue economy of Narragansett Bay. Of particular note, when you think about what Rhode Island lands and what are we actually reliant on, some of these fisheries are solely those, or primarily those that occur right in Narragansett Bay, specifically quahog and whelk. So when you think about the bay, it certainly holds a great value for commercial fisheries, particularly for our shellfish. Sometimes less thought in the economic component, but as well important is recreational fisheries. As many of us know, a lot of us here are probably avid anglers in Narragansett Bay and coastal southern New England. You can catch all types of species here, from scup, black sea bass, to togs, summer flounder, and bluefish, striped bass. But not only are these, culturally and recreationally significant for much of Rhode Island and Narragansett Bay, and a big part of who we are, but they themselves are a major economic driver for the state of Rhode Island and Narragansett Bay. When you think about tackle shops and, again, fuel, that's one whole sector. And then additionally, when we think of recreational fisheries, that comprises both the private angler, like you and I, going out on the bay or fishing from shore, but then also, for hire, party boats, charter boats that their goal is to try and introduce people who don't have a means to getting out on the water to fisheries and an opportunity to recreationally angle. All these commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries are taking place in the backdrop of a changing ecosystem. I wanted to kind of just give you a quick global perspective of what's happening or what has happened over time and where we fit in as Rhode Island and coastal southern New England. Here's just a map of showing the global warming of ocean sea temperatures over time, really just showing the rate of change, red being getting warmer over time, blue being getting colder over time. And when you look at where we are in New England, we are one of the fastest warming places on the planet. When you look at places like our neighbors just north of the Cape, you can see that not only is this trend increasing over time, but we're seeing this even accelerated rapid warming in recent years. So aside from an oceanographic perspective, and thinking about what this means for currents and temperature, salinity, et cetera, but what does it actually mean for those that live in the ocean full time? And that kind of really sets the backdrop to what we've been seeing here in Narragansett Bay. For those, I assume most of us are acquainted here with Narragansett Bay, but for a long period of time, we've been monitoring both the oceanography, water quality, and fish populations in Narragansett Bay at two sites, one being Fox Island and one being Whale Rock, a bay versus ocean type of proxy for sampling. And what we've seen over time is we have seen sea temperatures change in Narragansett Bay over time at both sites here and across the different seasons. What we've also seen is superimposed on these changes in temperature are changes in the fish community at both of these sites, the top figure being our bay site and the bottom figure being our more Rhode Island Sound or ocean site. And ultimately what we've seen over time is the change in species complex within Narragansett Bay, shifting from what was primarily a demersal fish community, things like winter flounder, red hake, northern sea robin, to a complex of both more pelagic species or what we might call Carolinian species, which would include things like butterfish, squid, summer flounder, and striped sea robin. And so what we've seen over time is we're still catching fish. It's not that the fish are not here, but we have somewhat of a revolving door of who's coming in and who's leaving Narragansett Bay. I think two of the species that really highlight this the most are American lobster and black sea bass. And what this has really kind of set the stage for in context is with this warming Narragansett Bay and really larger Atlantic East Coast or Northeast U.S. shelf is it sets up for effectively winners and losers of a changing ecosystem and environment, where you'll have some species like in our region, like the cold water preferring American lobster, where we saw as over time as its thermal habitat was the most suitable. We saw the greatest abundance in this species in the late 80s through the late 90s. And since that time, when we've seen warming waters and other changes and stressors for the species, we've seen dramatic declines. And these declines and trends really are mirrored across a number of surveys that we have in Rhode Island. Trawl surveys, ventless trap surveys, to larval surveys, so kind of all capturing the same type of trend. When we think of climate, we do have these instances where we've seen declines. Winter flounder is a very similar story. But we do see some species that are new to this system that have been, again, of great commercial and recreational interest, and in some ways have actually filled the void of some of the species that we have seen leave the ecosystems. And black sea bass is another one. It was one that we commonly would think of as a Narragansett Bay winner in this scenario, where for many years we saw very few black sea bass in our monitoring efforts through DEM in Narragansett Bay, with this tremendous spike and increase in black sea bass that we've really seen hold steady since that 2010 2011 period. And just by way of the themes for today, thinking back to David's talk this morning, really highlights the value of time series. Right? When we think about how do we contextualize how these systems are changing over time, and making sure we measure everything. Back in the 70s, black sea bass wasn't a real interest to Rhode Island. It wasn't much. There wasn't really a great interest in terms of its value for understanding regional stock assessments and such, but having consistent monitoring over time has really allowed us to capture these types of trends and be able to manage them appropriately based on what we've seen. And so, with this kind of poster children for Rhode Island of winner and loser of climate, I'll just take a quick look into what's going on with these species. I mentioned earlier in that last slide that we saw a significant increase in lobster in the 90s and a decline in the 2000s. And that is true for Narragansett Bay, but one of the things that we see in fisheries is that the patterns that we are actually oftentimes capturing in Narragansett Bay are regional patterns and trends. So while Narragansett Bay is special and important, in many ways, a lot of the stories sing true in the ecosystems across particularly southern New England and in our area, but sometimes along the East Coast. And so when you think about lobster, it's changed over time. We see here, kind of the pre-southern New England or Rhode Island lobster boom, where lobsters were primarily mid-Atlantic, southern New England offshore. And as habitat improved in terms of its preferences for temperature, changes in predators, less disease prevalence, you could see that the expansion or the ability for the population to move into coastal areas like Long Island Sound, southern New England, Narragansett Bay, Buzzards Bay. And where we've now moved as the waters are warmed here and the thermal habitat has actually improved for lobsters, is that we see the improvement or increase in abundance for lobsters in the Gulf of Maine at the same time we've seen this decline here in southern New England. So a lot of the patterns that we've seen in Narragansett Bay for lobster mirror our neighbors in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. Black sea bass is a similar regional story, but in the different direction. So just to orient you here, as we've seen waters warm, we've also seen a northern expansion of black sea bass, which traditionally was considered to be a Carolina, Maryland, New Jersey species. When we look at over time here, back in the 70s, and this basically orients you to where we are on the East Coast. So if you look at these values here, they correspond to this bottom figure. So when you look at earlier for both spring and fall surveys, that much of the time the black sea bass center of biomass is in this kind of Chesapeake off Maryland, Carolina, New Jersey area. Over time, what we've seen is that biomass center of gravity, or the center of the major portion of the stock, has actually shifted north into these areas off of New York and Rhode Island. The theory behind this is that as we've seen, as the fish that are located north of Hudson Canyon have moved offshore in the spring, that warmer water has allowed them to survive over winter. So instead of this higher mortality or die-off of sea bass that we would previously in decades see, that warmer environment has allowed for improved survivorship and thus a greater return of sea bass as they come back in the following year. And so when we think about that, these regional patterns, it's certainly of influence and importance to Rhode Island and Narragansett Bay, but very much so to the other estuaries that we see in our area. Again, synchrony is kind of the theme that we've seen for a lot of these fisheries and climate questions. Ultimately what we think, what this comes down to though is, as the species change, one or multiple, how do these species now interact with the community that, for individuals that may or may not be changing? And so, one of the questions we've often had is thinking of like a classic, Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay type of ecosystem framework for something like the lobster, which was a historically significant organism within Narragansett Bay. As you introduce sea bass, which may be a significant predator to this species, what is that new interaction? Is this part of the additional additive effect of why we see fewer lobsters? Is sea bass now outcompeting other animals within this system, food, shelter, and habitat, and other parts of the ecosystem that now may be off-kiltered or a bit disjointed from what we previously had seen? And so when we think about this in terms of like a single species, it's a little bit clear from our surveys, right? The species went up, the species went down, total biomass or numbers are stable or increasing. But what we have less of an understanding of is the interactions between these species in an ecosystem. So how have these species now, how has their interactions changed? In the bay, do they live in the same places? Do they need the same habitats? Do they start out-competing each other? Do they eat each other? Are they being eaten by a new individual? So this is an area of work that largely we have snapshots of ideas, but in terms of that time series, how have these species started to shift in terms of their interaction with each other remains a pretty big question. And so that's kind of the climate story. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm hopping in and out the different fisheries to try and highlight how dynamic Narragansett Bay is. So I'll shifting here now to quahogs, and I won't get too much into this. I'll let other speakers after me delve deeper into quahogs as well. But just as, by way of background, quahogs are the largest commercial fishery that resides solely in Narragansett Bay. So when you look at all the commercial fisheries that happen within Narragansett Bay, the greatest valued fishery is quahog. So there's a really strong connection between Narragansett Bay's blue economy and waterfront to the quahog fishery. Additionally, the quahogs serve a number of important ecosystem roles. They're filter feeders. They are prey for a number of different species in the ecosystem. And for those not familiar with quahogs, you probably know them as littlnecks, chowders, cherry stones, and such. But from a fisheries management perspective, what we're really looking to do is try and build programs that allow for continued harvest and the successive future generations of quahogs, so to allow for sustainability of the stock over time. We do this through a number of different ways. In a fisheries management framework, we'll try and use spatial management tools. We'll try and use things like minimum size or days that have access to do so. And that's all from your traditional fisheries, science, population dynamics framework. One of the interesting things with quahogs is that they're filter feeders. So there's a whole additional component of how we manage the Narragansett Bay system that's ultimately tied to water quality. So in addition to the fisheries management tools for management, there's I often consider a preceding management tool of our waters open or closed to shellfish in case of potential contaminants and such. And so there's really an interesting interaction here, different from a normal fisheries framework in my mind, of water quality and fisheries management tools, kind of overlapping or working together to try and understand both human and biological concerns for Rhode Islanders and quahogs respectively. So when thinking about this framework, part of our job within marine fisheries is trying to understand the standing stock. How many quahogs are out there? Similar to earlier, I showed you some trawl survey data from Narragansett Bay. Our office looks to monitor quahogs using a dredge survey, pictured down here. So we'll go out, we'll tow, we'll look over time how that catch has changed, how does it vary spatially. And so just to orient you here, these are just time series averages by station of catch. What you see here is that there are some areas where we see low quahog abundance, there's areas where we see high quahog abundance. The latter being often areas that are closer to inner parts of the estuary or embayments, and then particularly Upper Bay, Providence River, and what we would call Upper Area, Management Area A or 1A. And this is oftentimes tied to things like high phytoplankton availability and nutrients and food, but also it's tied to water quality, as you saw in the last figure here. Many of these areas have been closed or intermittently closed based on rain closures. So that you can see the inherent connection between biomass of quahogs and the water quality rules, measures that are in place. And historically, we've been very cognizant of this in terms of do these areas support, to what degree are these areas that are closed or partially closed really important for bay-wide populations, in terms of supporting that. And it's been really on the forefront of many of our minds, both harvesters, scientists, and managers, in thinking about how we manage areas as they become open in water quality. And I think this figure hits it really home well. In 2021, the lower Providence River area up here was became available to, based on water quality standards for fishing. And so we worked with industry to build plans for fisheries management and harvest schedules that allow for the fishery to access this area, as well as understand try and the sustainability of this area. What are rates that we can harvest that allow for future quahogs to reproduce and grow here and provide cultural, recreational, and commercial significance, as well as ecosystem services. And so what we see here, just as a give you a context of how important this area has been to the commercial fishery, you can see that up to 60% of landings last year of all of Rhode Island came from this lower area. And I think this really highlights the interaction between water quality and fisheries in an estuary, all the way up from, I guess, nuts to bolts of the whole system in terms of ecosystem management, and thinking of these ecosystem-based frameworks. And then additionally, I think it further highlights as the environment changes, both from water quality, climate, et cetera, the need for trying to coherently and consistently, collaboratively work towards management strategies to try and allow for these types of opportunities in the future, and really just stressing the interaction between these two types of frameworks. I thought I'd also really touch quickly on forage fish, particularly menhaden. This has been a really significant and important species historically for Rhode Island. As many of you know, menhaden supported a number of needs to our nation, and specifically Rhode Island. From a commercial standpoint, it's been a significant bait source for many commercial fisheries, and in other parts of the world, or the East Coast, it supports significant reduction fisheries. But in Narragansett Bay, within the estuary, that supports also there's a great value of menhaden in terms of its ecosystem services, really as prey for larger fish that we love to catch and see, like striped bass, bluefish, false albacore, bonito, bluefin tuna, coastal sharks. So there's been a really great emphasis and importance that's been placed on menhaden historically in trying to balance those needs. Both, what do harvesters fish commercially need, what do recreational anglers want in the ocean for their recreational needs, and then also just ecosystem function. How do we allow for these species that rely on menhaden to come year after year, continue to try and preserve the historical functions of those species given Rhode Island. So there's been a large emphasis on us trying to manage menhaden, commercially speaking. And so what we've done, very atypical to other estuaries along the East Coast, is build basically a management program within Narragansett Bay, where from May through October, 2 or 3 times a week, we will send a spotter pilot out who will quantify the biomass in each of these polygons that you see here in Narragansett Bay. We then use that information in a modeling framework to basically see when the fish are coming. So here's an example from 2017 of what I would consider a normal year for menhaden coming into the bay, where you'll see a significant pulse of them coming in as they move north in their spring migration. And then you'll see later in the year, summer and fall, as they move south, pulses coming back to Narragansett Bay. And so what we'll do is we'll use this data to basically inform, is there enough biomass in the bay to support both ecosystem and commercial needs? So what we'll have is, if the biomass hits a certain trigger, that's when we would allow for the commercial fishery to take place. And it's not until that we've hit that threshold that we would keep it, that we would open it. Otherwise, it would remain closed to try and support the ecosystem needs for various species, as well as those seeking both commercially and recreationally or culturally purposed types of harvest for those other species, like I mentioned, striped bass, bluefish, etc. What we've seen over time, in particular recent years, is a high variability of whether the fish come into the bay or not. It's been, in some years we'll see millions and millions of fish. In other years, we won't see very many at all. And so much of our work has been trying to figure out what's inducing this variability, what really has been causing the fish to come in and out, whether it's water quality or hypoxia extent. Is it really what's happening offshore? Are the currents suitable for the little ones to get pushed into coastal Rhode Island? Is it rainfall? They just don't want to come near these big plumes. This was a pretty big phenomenon this year along the whole East Coast, particularly Maine, where the fish didn't show up inshore there until much later than normal. Many are hypothesizing that it's because of how rainy it's been. All that rainfall has come into the coastal areas, keeping them offshore a bit. So, and with menhaden being a historical one, we're now seeing more and more different forage fish, like chub mackerel, spot, and fish, moving into this area. So again, thinking back to that climate scenario story earlier, yes, menhaden are in good health, good standing, but there are other forage fish species that are that may prefer being here over many days. We see kind of that revolving door of this trophic level. I'm going to hit on two last species here really quick, and I'll move through them really quickly. For the Atlantic sturgeon, obviously it's not a species that anyone's directly targeting or looking to catch, and is endangered, but our office does a lot of work in trying to understand where sturgeon are in Rhode Island, and as well as try to help rebuild the population coastwide through our participation in national and regional fishery science and management. Historically, as many of you probably know, the sturgeon had thought to, or had been believed to be spawning in the Taunton River, which not within Narragansett Bay necessarily, but certainly using the east passage of Narragansett Bay in the Conor River to get up to the Taunton River. We don't know if we've had spawning there essentially, particularly the last 20 years, but we certainly have had many reports, or several reports that have come in that have saw a sturgeon off Hope Island, saw a sturgeon here and there. So part of the challenge is that there isn't a great monitoring tool that we have had as a program to really understand how presence, absence, or abundance has changed over time for sturgeon within Rhode Island. One of the ways that we've worked to address that is implement acoustic telemetry throughout Rhode Island state waters. For those, just by way of background, we'll use these little water bottle looking things called receivers. We place them and install them throughout Rhode Island waters, and then as fish that are tagged with acoustic tags by other researchers or ourselves move through by these receivers, they'll ping. And so this has been really helpful in collaborating with partners all up and down the East Coast and Atlantic Canada to try and understand what's actually living here that we don't see in our surveys. So sturgeon's a prime example of that, where a number of researchers have tagged sturgeon, and we've been able to pick them up on our receivers as they move through Rhode Island. So we haven't really had this quantifiable data before of where they are and when they come through. And what we've seen is that at a minimum, they're using coastal Rhode Island and lower Narragansett Bay as a migratory pathway to other parts, either Narragansett Bay or further up and down the coast. So as we get more years of data and collaborate further with some of those individuals tagging sturgeon, we'll be able to get more information about their habitat utilization here. And lastly, just kind of hitting on future fisheries topic that everybody likes to chat about is the blue crab. We don't see too many blue crabs in Rhode Island. We do see some in the summer and some of that brackish water, but we don't see populations like they would see in the Chesapeake Bay. But coming back to the point made earlier about we're usually monitoring too late. We're not usually monitoring on time. We've really tried to take a better look at trying to both look at time series data as to what are we seeing for blue crab, actually increasing like people think they are or not, as well as evaluate the tools that we're using to do so. So the first, we've started to take a look at all of our sampling, all the various surveys that are happening around across water bodies to see what is the actual trends. And what we've seen over time when using these surveys to build a composite index is the black line. We have seen gradual increases in blue crabs going back to the 70s, but really it's this big peak in 2010 that kind of pops out and drives the time series. So I'll let folks hypothesize as to what happened in 2010. It might be dictating some of that patterns, was it flood, was it something else? But I think this is the types of tools, leveraging these types of data sets to get a better understanding of what we may be in for or not with new emerging species in our area, and what that means for opportunities in how recreational, commercial, and what that means for these ecosystems. What is blue crab filling the role of? Who is it eating? Who is it eating? We're also looking to enhance these surveys. We don't have any surveys built specifically for blue crab. In Chesapeake, they'll use dredge surveys to actually monitor blue crab populations. So that's what we've started to do in Narragansett Bay. Build a survey that's properly designed to monitor blue crab populations and sample them in the winter when they're dormant. Proper surveys would do when they're buried in the mud and easy to catch. So we've started building random stratified sampling designs to try and actually sample for blue crabs and understand spatially where do we see them, does abundance change by month, do we see sexual dimorphism, or males hanging out in one place and females hanging out in the other. And so just thinking about future of fisheries, I'll end kind of where a fishery is going. I guess in my perspective, much of the fishermen that I work with have shifted over time from a single species dominant fishery to a multidisciplinary harvester. So when we think about, it's almost, I would consider it like portfolio. So it's very, there are some people who certainly only fish for one species still, but most of the people now who are fishing, they're fishing for a whole suite of things. You may be a quahogger, horseshoe crab harvester, mantis shrimp harvester, also commercial or higher bluefin tuna, captain, running fish traps, increase in whelk activity, sea bass, scup pot fishery. So I think there's been less of single species minded fisheries and now moving more in towards this kind of multidisciplinary approach and taking opportunities where you can, both when the fish are here and when the management allows for it. And part of our program has been trying to build that flexibility. How do we move forward in a changing climate that allows for folks to keep fishing and have access to different species when the science says it can be harvested, and try and provide that type of multidisciplinary approach to ensue. And I'll end with Jonah crab in the lobster fishery. As I mentioned earlier, American lobster has declined significantly throughout southern New England. When we saw that decline happening in the 2000s, what we also saw is the increase in Jonah crab landings by this exact same fleet. Jonah crab historically was a bycatch species, just thrown right off the deck after it was caught. What we've seen is with the decline in lobster in southern New England, as well as with a better market and price for Jonah crab, we have seen an increase in the landings for this species. So there's an optimism, right, in terms of being able to pivot and being adaptable to climate. From a business standpoint, one of the other challenges now we face is for this data-limited species, how do we manage it? We don't know how fast it grows, how fast it dies, its reproduction capacity largely. So it's shifted a lot of research and management into trying to make sure that this remains a species that harvests good fish from. And with that, thank you, and if I have time, I'll take questions. Otherwise, happy to chat with you. Time for one. I'll try and pick one at random. How many fish? I'll just pick the main one that's that first. How many fishermen really rely on that? I think it depends on, I guess, rely. There's a number of businesses that will fish, at a larger scale for menhaden if the area is open. In kind of a not industrial but larger scale fashion. There's a lot of interest, almost like in an artisanal framework, to try and harvest menhaden for yourself, use it as integrated into your business model. I think who relies on, I guess, from a recreational angler as a harvester themselves, they would say they all rely on it. I think much of what we've seen in this excitement for bluefin tuna and sharks and bonito and albacores in lower Narragansett Bay, a lot of that is, that excitement is from the commercial and recreational angling community is believed to be tied to the availability of forage fish. So how we manage menhaden, the status of chub mackerel, despite the decline of some of our other historically interesting or of interest forage species like herring, Atlantic mackerel.
Okay, thank you so much, Conor. Next up is Deirdre Robinson. Deirdre is the co-director of the Saltmarsh Sparrow Research Initiative, a team of community scientist volunteers working to study saltmarsh sparrows at Jacobs Point Saltmarsh in Warren, Rhode Island. While an assistant professor in the graduate school at the University of Rhode Island, Deirdre earned a master's degree in biological sciences, specializing in avian ecology. In 1990, she began banding birds and monitoring saltmarsh sparrows in Galilee, Rhode Island, and is currently a master bird bander. She's keenly interested in the behavioral ecology of saltmarsh birds and their vulnerability to climate change, while providing opportunities for students to develop the skills that they'll need for careers in conservation biology.
morning. I'm going to try to connect three dots. The concept of biophilia, which some of you are familiar with, and maybe a new term for others of you, with our work on saltmarsh sparrows, but also connecting that with what we badly needed, which is behavioral changes within our species if the planet has any chance of being healthier than it is now. So philia was first recorded as a term by Aristotle 320 before the current era, and the biophilia hypothesis was first introduced by E.L. Wilson and his co-author in 1993, and they defined it as the innate tendency to connect to other living things. Other authors have been bolder and have dared to use the four-letter word love. It's an affective response that David referred to when you get out of the car and you have the experience of being in nature. And it's interesting that they could have titled their book The Biophilia Explosion or The Biophilia Fact, but they chose hypothesis because they wanted it to be tested. And many authors have gone on to test, is biophilia a real thing or not? Can it be measured? And many of us know that many of us among us have an aversion to non-interval data, so you're trying to measure attitude or affection. It gets a little too gray for some people. But social scientists have taken the lead, and they have pointed out that if you were to choose which of these species you feel the most affinity toward, I would guess it's probably not the banana, which of course turns out is not a banana at all. But herps, reptiles, they don't seem to evoke the biophilia that mammals do. Now, I'm guessing that most of you would probably pick the German Shepherd or the bunny as having the greatest affinity. Or pufferfish. I mean, hypertelorism, which is a increased space between our eyes, is actually a feature that humans are selecting each other for. Have you noticed that? We also are drawn, of course, toward any youthful-looking animals. So marketers have exploited this, and they use little baby mammals to try to sell us things quite effectively. Also, animals with big eyes we're drawn to. But which of these species is our survival most dependent upon? It's probably the one that you feel the less affinity to, and that would be the pollinator. I'm looking forward to a lecture later by Katie Burns on pollinators, because their future and our future are interwoven. So biophilia can be an effective agent for behavioral change. Now, I think everybody in this room realizes that we don't have the luxury of just studying a species or an ecosystem, but that we actually have to get the message out that we have to change our behavior. The resistance to behavioral change is hardwired in humans, and there's a component of it that we haven't probably paid enough attention to it, and I'm going to give you a demonstration of this. If I ask you to do one behavioral change, and that is simply take your right arm and just reach up gently a little bit. Okay, just reach up a little bit. So extend your elbow, okay, and now come down. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you to reach outside your comfort zone. And in order to do that, watch what you do first. I want you to reach as farther than you think you can reach with your right arm. Try it. Farther. Higher. Okay. Did you see the weight shift? In order to do that, you have to, this prerequisite behavior, and that's a weight shift. And what's been missing from the literature and from some of the efforts that we made is how best to prepare people for behavioral change. Joe Prochaska at URI has done a lot of sentinel work in this area. What's the opposite of biophilia? Anybody? Biophobia, the guy with the cool beard, you got that. And biophobia, oftentimes people think it's just a fear of snakes or scorpions. And is that innate or is that learned? Or is it, the answer to most of these questions is a confluence of both factors. Well, it can range from rabid fear to indifference, hopelessness, not bothering to vote, giving up. So biophilia is actually an active agent that is adding to a situation that we find ourselves in now, which is the period, we no longer call it the Eocene, the Holocene. By many experts in the field in geology, it is now referred to as the Anthropocene. And anthros meaning human, scene meaning period, is the period in which human activity has taken the planet beyond its carrying capacity. That's the period that we are in. So I'm here from the Saltmarsh Sparrow Research Initiative, and you all know that science is a team sport, and I'm very lucky to partner with Steve Reiner and Jim O'Neill, my co-directors, for the last 8 years. And we've had multiple students pass through our marsh and go on to do great things. We have 2 indoctoral programs now. So this is the bird I want to talk about. It used to be called the sharp-tailed sparrow, you can see for obvious reasons. Why study saltmarsh sparrows? Well, because they're exceptional. They're most unlike any other bird. They're non-territorial, most birds are. They only have a rudimentary song. It's called a complex whisper. They nest just above the ground, about 2 centimeters, and they've done that for millennia successfully. They often prefer running to flying because it's metabolically less demanding. If you look up in the, oops, sorry about that. Let's go backwards. Backwards. Am I going backwards or forward? Oh, let's go backwards. You already know that. Here's where they are. So see this small territory here from the mid-Atlantic up to Maine. In the entire world, this species only breeds between Virginia and Maine. And Rhode Island has a healthy population. They're also interesting because they have an unusual breeding system. This is usually where audiences take interest. They're probably the most promiscuous species of bird in the entire planet. The female, on any given nest, paternity is usually 2.5 males. And it's actually a strategy that's good for diversity. The female exclusively does all the nest building and rearing of the fledglings, and she feeds them for a couple weeks after they fledge. So they're just 2 centimeters above the ground, and they don't want to move forward. Why study them? Because they're on the brink of extinction. They're often referred to as the canaries in the coal mine, global warming and rising sea levels. The saltmarsh sparrow, which is very likely to become extinct within the next 12 years, 2035 is probably an optimistic date for them. They are the first bird in North America that will be extinct due to sea level rise. On the left is this iconic photo of a Welsh miner with the classic canary in the coal mine. And of course, you know the story, when the gases are so toxic in the coal mine, the canary dies first and the coal miners dig a path out of the mine if they can. This is a sketch, a charcoal sketch by one of our interns. You'll see his picture later. His name is Joel Eckerson. And he submitted this sketch for a peer-reviewed art exhibit. He chose charcoal. He chose the same skinny, probably lung-diseased miner. But he placed the saltmarsh sparrow outside the globe. And I asked him, why did you do that? He's 18 years old, and he says, in his wisdom, there's no more room on the planet for this species. His biophilia is off the scale. This is our study site. It's just 5 miles from here on Jacobs Point, and it's owned by the Warren Land Conservation Trust, and it borders on Audubon Society property. And it's on the East Coast. It runs into the bike path. So there's really no room with all of this housing here for this marsh to migrate at all. On a typical fall day, this is a drone picture, and I want to call your attention to these runnels that were put in here in the 30s and 40s to reduce mosquito populations. So it's a beautiful fall day. Now the next drone picture will be shot as if the drone is here looking in this direction, and this is after a king tide, which we're seeing more and more frequently. And those are the runnels that I pointed out to you. They're completely flooded, and we had multiple nests in here, and they were all flooded. And sometimes people say to me, well, why don't they build their nests in trees like wild birds? And say, no, why don't we grow webbing between our toes so that we can learn to swim in them? You know, we don't have that sort of DNA flexibility. This is Joel, and this shows what our habitat looks like. It's very windy, it's open, it's very hot. There's limited fresh water here, and all of these have implications, which I'll tell you about briefly. And Joel we've just captured this female, and he found her nest. It has 7 eggs, which is very unusual. So like someone said earlier, you're always looking for the exception to the rule. And we take measurements on them, and we record them over the last 8 years. And we are a low-budget operation. It looks as if we have to hire enough birds to record their own data here. We're not that desperate. So the main question we asked over these 7 years was, what are the outcomes? What's the nest survival? How are they doing? And it turns out that Jacobs Point Warren has one of the most productive habitats. Tom Kutcher knows this better than anybody, than most all other studies. So we have a 28% success rate, which compares, for example, in Connecticut to 5 or 7%. But our main issue, of course, is flooding with depredation secondary, and they're reciprocal. Some years we have more flooding, and those years we have more depredation. Each of us had also other questions that we wanted to answer. Steve Reinert is very interested in the large picture ecosystem, and he's a data crunch guru. So he measured the vegetation surrounding every one of those nests and compared them to random sites. And what he found has management implications, and that is the birds who had the successful nests tended to build their nests in closer proximity to the high tide bush. And that isn't surprising because high tide bush is a higher elevation. So management implications for us are that maybe we can dredge some of those runnels and create these micro-habitats of higher elevation that are favorable to high tide bush that have more successful rates. It's actually a low budget kind of intervention. We're working with Save the Bay, talking about this right now. And the other question we had, Jim O'Neill was particularly interested in was, well, who are the predators? Because we're losing 25% of the nest of predators. Who do you think this is? I found this one morning at 5:30 in the morning across the lake pad. Yeah, that's clearly raccoon. And we were suspicious. Raccoons, we see them a lot, and we see mink a lot. We're very suspicious of those are the main predators. We often find depredated nests. So Jim installed these trail cameras, and a shout out to the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, Kyra and Dave. They gave us a grant, the Gonzala family grant. We were able to purchase these cameras, and Jim set them up on these 32 cameras. And here's a Rorschach test too. So I'm in there every morning filming these birds because we color banded them all, and I'd like to know who's back by taking pictures of their color bands. So who do you see in the background here? You. A white-tailed deer. It was a huge surprise to us. So these trail cameras reveal that the deer are depredating the Saltmarsh sparrow nest. The first time this was documented. Shout out to the Rhode Island Natural History Survey for supporting us to do this. Otherwise, this fact would not be known. An area that I'm interested in is, are there morphological changes in this bird as it tries to adapt to climate change? And I was familiar with this rule that in animals who are adapted to cold climates have shorter and thicker appendages so they can conserve heat. Animals adapted to warmer climates tend to have larger appendages so they can actually radiate heat. And I've been lucky. I've lived in 4 different countries and visited 27 other countries. I've done some teaching in Africa and Asia, and I've noticed there are morphological differences in our species. And it's related oftentimes to how they're adapted to the climate, right? So this concept of Darwin's rule has been updated with a corollary that animals, that birds that live in freshwater limited habitats, such as Saltmarsh, where they're open and there's no opportunity for shade, have to develop some way of coping with the extra heat. And so they did these lovely infrared studies on a related species called song sparrow, and you can see how much, oops, there we go again, wrong button. Am I going the right way? Oh, here, I'm good. All right, sorry. You can see that the bright yellow shows how much heat they're dissipating, that the bills of sparrows, and what else, are acting as heat sinks. What else? The legs. So I decided, well, we need to measure the bill surface area and the legs of these species, and we need to be able to compare it to historic specimens. So I visited every museum on the Atlantic coast that houses these, and I compared them to measurements we took this year. And the results, I can tell you, we're still crunching the data, but I can tell you the results are very surprising. So this is a question we asked this year, and I'll wrap up right here. We had permission from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Rhode Island DEM to actually try to lift nests above flooding thresholds. Very low budget, $5 a shot. We got these coffee cage containers, bamboo, and lifted the nests. And the first question was, will the females continue to feed them? And the answer was yes, right away. They are compelled to feed them. Another question we have is, can we camouflage them enough? We don't know the answer to this yet. We're hoping we get our permits free to do in the next 2 years. So I think they're pretty well camouflaged, but I'm not the predator for this, so I would be queuing into something different. So conservation biology is a discipline with a deadline. And I'm probably going to, what if we don't change at all? Will something magical happen? The answer is no. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. As Margaret said, indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that's pretty much who we are. A small group of dedicated students and the three of us. And I'm just going to, I don't want to run out of time, so this is my last message to you all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. I feel inspired. It's sad. Okay, next up, we have Dr. Sara Grady. Sara started her academic career in the Narragansett Bay Watershed at Brown University, then attended the Boston University Marine Program in Woods Hole, where she studied horseshoe crab population dynamics and management on Cape Cod. Sara spent 18 years working for the Mass Bays National Estuary Partnership, which is our partner to the Northeast. And just last month, she transitioned to working with Mass Audubon, where she is senior coastal ecologist on the restoration team. She lives in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and spends her free time involved with Cub Scouts, BSA, and Girl Scouts, and singing with her friends band in Narragansett.
So, despite the fact that I am newly to Mass Audubon, I'm not representing Mass Audubon with this talk. I just have a little caveat. Mass Audubon does do a lot of work with horseshoe crab, particularly recently a lot of advocacy. But in this case, I am pretty much presenting as me. The me that did her dissertation on horseshoe crabs, and has been doing volunteer spawning surveys with the state of Massachusetts for, I think, 15 years. I'm also here representing the me that is known for doing things like singing. And when I was asked to do this talk by my friend Courtney, she kind of offhandedly said, oh, well, you know, it's a fun group. You can do whatever you want. Maybe you can sing a sea shanty. Well, when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to be part of the Sea Education Association as a summer program. And I spent about 3 weeks sailing a 125-foot stay-sail schooner around Cape Cod Bay, and learned all sorts of great things about oceanography and nautical science. But there was also some maritime history, and that was when I first discovered sea shanties. And at the time on that boat, I had written a sea shanty about the boat, just for fun, and that never really went anywhere, but the tune has lived on in my head since then. So at Courtney's prompting, which may or may not have been a joke, I'm not sure, my entire presentation is going to be a sea shanty. And hopefully this works out. So there's two different tunes. One is the one that I came up with on the boat, and then the other one is one that has gotten extremely popularized sea shanties these days. All right, and hopefully I can click these things at the right time. And I apologize for reading because I ordinarily hate that kind of thing. I'm a big eye contact person, but in this case, there's absolutely no way I could ever memorize this. All right, here we go. So to start quite broad, our friends in arthropod, exoskeleton, legs with joints. But despite their name, they're not a crab, they're not the same, and we split away at this point. The Chelicerata are a group you gotta see with their tiny claws. They use this pair as a way to tear their food and put it in their jaws. Merostomata means mouth in the middle as it walks along, it rhymes. Picking up some food that gets thoroughly chewed, most small things that it finds. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. What about their kin? Limulus. Cousins to spiders and scorpions. The horseshoe crab you've met is part of a quartet of species that exist. Another 3 in the clan, India, Japan, Southeast Asia, that's the list. And the Japanese, the crab they did believe, samurai in battle they did fall. Inspired Pokemon, Kabuto and Kabutops, you've gotta catch 'em all. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. What's under that shell? Limulus, Polyphemus. Well, I'm just about to tell. They have 3 body parts, and their body starts with a prosoma in the front. The telson's in the back, but they don't attack you with it. It's quite blunt. Give a friend a flip, claws like scissors that can snip, and 10 armored walking legs. Layers of foot gills that spiky mouth the middles, and a vent for sperm and eggs. To tell the sex of these crabs is not complex once they reach maturity. The male gets boxer claws that are quite crucial because they hold female shells with ease. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. That's our horseshoe crab. Limulus has those special claws so they can grab. Florida to Maine, there's something really plain. Atlantic crabs, they grow. The largest on the shore, up to a foot or more. They're the biggest ones we know. In May and June, both at midnight and at noon, they come in shore to spawn. It is quite a sight to go to the beach at night and see them carry on. A moon that's full or new brings a tide that's higher too, which the horseshoe crabs prefer. Higher on the beach, their eggs are out of reach till the next spring tide occurs. limulus, polyphemus, limulus, mating on the shore, limulus, polyphemus. But wait, there is still more. Do the crabs get stuck on the beach? For sure, that's yucky for anyone that can smell. Sometimes what you find is the mold that's left behind, a thin and crunchy shed-off shell. When crabs of two sexes pair an amplexus, they wander around 2 by 2. Male boxer claws latch on the female and attach him to her until they're through. The eggs are bluish-green, almost too small to be seen unless you're looking close. Buried underground, they aren't often found except by shorebirds and science pros. Limulus, polyphemus, limulus. The female's full of eggs, limulus, polyphemus. By the end of the season, all that's left is dregs. After 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, that batch of eggs will finally hatch, releasing trilobite larvae. Check out their baby pics after multiple 1 through 6, and here they start to stray. We don't see them much, they don't write, don't keep in touch for about the next decade. They're eating in the deep, no reason for them to keep near shore where it's less safe. Limulus, polyphemus, limulus, why do we even care? Limulus, polyphemus, hang on, I'm about to share. Oh, once in a time, not long ago, people did not like horseshoe crabs, you know, accused of eating all the clams on the shore of Barnstable County. The towns, they said, to kill them all, poor horseshoe crabs, they took the fall, and people brought their tails to the town hall to get a bounty. It turns out that what they eat is worms and amphipods, what a treat. Maybe a clam or 3, but really, who could blame them? And now we have changed our mind, they're important for bird and humankind. We learn about their eyes by looking at what theirs can do. However, we have also found that they make the best bait around for catching whelks, and that is causing problems for them too. A shorebird called the red knot can still fly so far, so quite a lot, from South America to the Arctic on their migration. On the way they stop to rest, they think horseshoe crabs are best for bulking up and getting fat and reaching satiation. Feeding this little bird is very important. I'm sure you've heard how these two animals are strongly linked together. Their blood is blue, that's because of copper, and it clots up as an infection stopper. This is the very quality that we wanted to claim. 1/3 of the blood inside a crab is extracted in a sterile lab and used to test all kinds of drugs, and that's the claim to fame. When you look at a horizon line, your eyes adjust so they refine the difference between dark and light edges with your vision. The horseshoe crab can do this too, an important skill for them, it's true. This clarity of borders is called lateral inhibition. For 150 million years old, these crabs are worth their weight in gold, but even so, they are still harvested for bait. The greatest source of mortality is harvest for the whelk fishery. The crabs are gathered up and put in pieces in a bait bag. Some of them are caught by hand by people walking on the sand, while others are collected from a boat using a drag. With horseshoe crabs in both these states, the governments who regulates the number and the size of all the crabs that can be taken. And as they learn more, they adjust, but many feel it's still unjust to harvest any crabs at all. The states must be mistaken. So now I sung my song, I hope you learned as it went along. Now I would be quite glad to answer all your questions. La 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 la. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Okay, so to answer questions, well, first of all, thank you. Best time. All right. I like that. It's good. Yeah, so they've been around since way before the dinosaurs, and they're ancient than many, many of the other inverts. 450 million years old is like way, way back. Have we simulated horseshoe crab blood, and why not use that? Well, yeah, so that is something that is in progress. And it does kind of work. It's really held up in a lot of FDA red tape right now. And it doesn't quite work as well. I think there's a lot of stock put in that as a way to save the crabs. But the biomedical, if you imagine sort of the bait harvest is really big and the biomedical harvest is actually pretty small. And then all of the bait crabs, all of them die. And then of the biomedical crabs, only about 25% of them die through the whole process, which is still pretty big. But it's it is probably. It's a good tactic to think about having the substitute blood for bait, but really, or not for bait, sorry, for biomedical purposes. But I think the greatest gains could be made by the bait management. Have I met Eli Nixon? Yes. Another bait that, who eats whelk anyway? Whelk is actually a surprisingly big, it's a big fishery. It's one of those under the radar fisheries, kind of. And there are issues in the whelk fishery right now too, because it's currently being harvested just as those whelks are reaching legal size, so it's a really strained fishery. There's a much greater effort per catch, so that a catch per unit effort is lower. And that's putting strain on the horseshoe crabs as well. It is true, they do have multiple eyes. They have 9 eyes. A lot of them are photoreceptors. The 2 big ones on the front are the ones that let them do the lateral inhibition, which when I do a longer non-singing version of this talk, I have, if you have ever done the, looked at the optical illusions where you have the different gray bands next to each other and it almost looks like it's curved, that's due to lateral inhibition, or the one where it has the grid and the gray dots kind of float in the intersection, also lateral inhibition. Oh, let's see, new protections. New protections for horseshoe crabs and Cape, yes. They, so Massachusetts, and I apologize, I'm not super familiar with the Rhode Island regulations, maybe DEM can chime in. But in Massachusetts, there was already one biomedical harvester, and now there are 2. So the biomedical quota was split between the 2 of those, and they kind of had to codify that. And then to compensate for the additional pressure there, the state quota was reduced from 165,000 crabs to 140,000 crabs. Do I have a Spotify, Instagram events for my band? That's a good question. They should. I'm not like the social media person for them, and they're not social media people. We have a really ridiculous podcast. It's really crazy. But I'm like the house band for it. It's called 2 Cat Kitchen. And it's like a guest comes on and cooks something, but then they also play an instrument, and then there's this guy who talks about Rhode Island history, but like kind of wanders all over the place. You guys would love it. If you're Rhode Islanders, it's like right up Rhode Island's alley, I would say, because it's just weird. And we know people in Rhode Island like weird. So. All right, thank you.
That's right. Thank you, Sara, for bringing your full self today. That was just awesome. Truly. Next up, we have Carolyn Mostello. Carolyn has been a coastal waterbird biologist with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife for over 20 years. She coordinates statewide conservation efforts for rare and endangered seabirds and shorebirds, especially terns and piping plovers, working closely with partners and landowners to effect beneficial management actions. She's led protection, research, and management activities, including habitat restorations for roseate and common terns on the Buzzards Bay nesting islands since 2000. After receiving her master's degree in zoology from the University of Hawaii in 1996, Carolyn began studying seabird colonies in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and became fascinated with marine and coastal birds, which are among the most vulnerable of bird taxa. Welcome, Carolyn.
Whistling my presentation. Well, I want to thank the program for inviting me to speak today about one of my favorite subjects, which is habitat restoration for terns. So terns are small seabirds. These two species that I'm talking about today are migratory. So they come up to Massachusetts in, starting in April. They nest up here, and then they start heading down to South America in August, September, some of them into October. They're primarily piscivorous. They're mostly feeding on small bait fish, and they also take some squid and crustaceans. So these two species are both state listed. The common tern is state listed as special concern. There are about 28,000 pairs breeding in the state now, and the population is increasing. And their breeding range is fairly broad on the Atlantic coast, from Newfoundland and Labrador down to South Carolina. They also breed in the interior of the U.S. And then there's the roseate tern. This is a federally listed species. It's endangered, has a much more narrow breeding range, and this range is actually contracted quite a bit. That was one of the reasons why the roseate tern was listed, and it continues to contract today. The breeding range is just from Nova Scotia and Quebec down to New York. Massachusetts has about 50-55% of the population. 3,600 pairs out of about 5,300 for the US total. So there's quite a big difference between the abundance of these two species. Luckily, over the past several years, both the Massachusetts and US populations have been increasing. And these species are sympatric on the breeding grounds. Roseate terns will only nest where common terns are breeding. So I'm going to talk about the habitat restoration work we did on Bird Island in Upper Buzzards Bay. It's located in Marion. It's a very low island. Max elevation is about 10 feet. It's close to the mainland, just about half a mile. Mass wildlife, in fact, our parent agency, Department of Fish and Game, has a conservation restriction on it, but the ownership is the town of Marion. So it's got a little bit of history for a small island. This is what it looked like 100 years ago or so. There's still currently a lighthouse on the island that dates to 1819, and there's a revetment or seawall that goes around most of the island except for the northern spit. That dates probably to the mid-1850s. And there's about 2 acres of habitat inside of that seawall. So if you look at this revetment, you can see it was built kind of in an old style with a vertical wall. And you don't see that too much anymore because it's a reflective surface. So waves slam into it and it's not very stable. So why is Bird Island so important? It's typically the second and sometimes the first largest colony for the roseate tern in North America. And we've got this super restricted breeding range already, and the birds like to be really aggregated. So there's suitable habitat all over the place in the Northeast, hosting lots and lots of common tern pairs, but really very few of these sites are sites where roseate terns want to nest. So we've got these roseates that are really, really aggregated at 3 sites: Bird Island, Ram Island, which is just a few miles away, and then Great Gull Island in New York. So each of these sites is incredibly important to the overall population. So, you know, they've been listed for about 35 years. Why don't we just get them to spread out to different sites? Well, we try to do that all the time, but they're not inclined to move. It seems that they like to nest in dense groups with other roseate terns. So we found that when we're trying to grow roseate terns and protect roseate terns, what we need to really do is to work with the islands that we have, because that's where we can be the most effective. It doesn't mean that we abandon our other sites. We very much need alternative sites for the birds to nest in case there are really big problems on their main nesting islands. For instance, back in 2003, some of you may remember the Bouchard oil spill that affected both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Ram Island was very heavily oiled, and we actually forced the roseates off of Ram, and they dispersed to other sites to breed. So those alternative sites are important, but when we're trying to grow the birds, we're often working with the sites where we can be most effective. All right, so I showed you a picture of that vertical wall, and that is very conducive to erosion on the island because it's a reflective surface. You can see in the bottom left how the seawall had gotten broken up over the years. That's the south end of the island, which receives quite a lot of wave energy. So with that deterioration comes a decrease in elevation. Remember, the island is only 10 feet. It's not going to go any higher because there's a lighthouse at the top of it. We start seeing increases in Saltmarsh as the elevation declines, and then that also comes to the corresponding decrease in nesting habitat. The birds, because they're so attached to these sites, they don't really branch out. What they do is they continue to nest there, but in much more crowded circumstances. When you have that crowding, you get much more aggression. Between commons and roseates, it's the common terns that are the aggressive ones, and the roseate terns are often forced out of the areas where they want to be. So we really needed to take steps to remedy the degradation of this habitat so that we could continue to support roseate terns in Buzzards Bay and respond to the climate change that's already upon us. I do want to point out that in the top right, the nesting area pre-restoration is in green there. That represents about half of the available nesting habitat on the island. So those erosional ponds and the areas around the revetment are about an acre, and then the nesting habitat's about an acre. So you can see how much potential the island had compared to what was actually could be utilized. All right, so the objectives of our restoration were to stabilize the island, so we keep it there, to nourish it with appropriate substrate for the terns, and to revegetate it. And we used the maximum sea level rise scenarios in our assessments of what we needed to do. There were 3 major partners on this project: my agency, Mass Wildlife, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which funded about 65% of the project through their Aquatic Ecosystems Restoration Program, and the town of Marion as the landowner. So this project was a really long time in development. It was first conceived in the late 90s. I was just like a newbie at Mass Wildlife. We were finally able to start construction in late 2015, and then we completed it in 2018 at a cost of about $6 million. So the design was basically to rebuild that revetment in a way that decreased the energy reaching the island. So we had to build it in a modern style. It was much wider. It was higher to accommodate sea level rise. It had a sloping face instead of that reflective face, and it had voids in between the stones. And that's so that the water can get lost in those stones and the energy can dissipate in the revetment itself instead of it water coming up at high energy over the island. We nourished with gravelly sand. That's the stuff that the terns prefer. And we were able to increase nesting habitat that way. And we actually, I'm afraid to say this, but we decreased the amount of salt marsh on the island in order to accommodate these birds. It was very kind of a remnant salt marsh, not classic salt marsh, but given the rarity of these birds and the importance of the island, we felt it was appropriate to reclaim some of that salt marsh for the birds. And then we planted seaside goldenrod and American beach grass to provide shelter for the birds. And then we had some finer scale customizations that we did. First of all, we built this concrete curb around the revetment. So based on what we know of a previous restoration in Connecticut, we knew that terns could get stuck in the revetment, in the voids, and we wanted to make sure that chicks weren't able to access those voids. So we built this curb so that they couldn't get over it until they could fly. And then we put these short little projections along the wall. So anyone who studied birds and terns, and in fact, a lot of birds knows that once they hit an edge, they will like to run along it, kind of corrals them. It's like a tern drift fence. And they're territorial birds. When they go out of territory, adults from neighboring territories will attack them. And it's very dangerous for them. So we didn't want them going too far out of territory. So every 10 meters or so, we place these projections. And so we got these little chick pile-ups in the corners. You can see on the bottom left, there's 2 common terns in the upper right and 2 roseate terns by the beach grass. And so they stay pretty close to territory there. We were also concerned about the level of vegetation that we see coming up on these tern nesting islands. It's a problem, across the range. The islands get very heavily vegetated because of the tern poop that's all over them. And what starts happening is that the parents cannot find spaces to come in and feed the chicks. It's hard to imagine when you see pictures like this that would ever be to that extent, but it very much gets to that extent. So we built this cobble ring around the island that would provide a relatively low vegetation area where, no matter how vegetated it got elsewhere, the older chicks could go to this cobble ring and get provision there. And then there were some leftover armor stones that didn't make it into the wall, and we had the contractor place these in clusters to attract the roseate terns because they do like that structure quite a bit. This cobble ring also wound up serving as a water reservoir, essentially, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is just an aerial where you can see these features that we used in the design, that chick curb around most of the island, that cobble ring, and the arbor stone clusters. So we built this over a few seasons. The first construction winter, we were able to get about 50% of the revetment built, and then we had to do some fixes, and I'll talk more about fixes in a little bit. The second winter, we finished the revetment, we nourished the island, we planted it, and we did more fixes, and then the third construction season, we did more fixes. So, as you may have gathered, not everything went smoothly. It would have been nice if everything went more smoothly, but it didn't, and I'm sure it's that way in most restoration projects. First of all, we had problems with material, shelter, we had problems with the revetment and entrapments, problems related to construction and quality control. So I'll go into each one of those. Okay, so when we first planted the island in spring, the plants were very, very tiny. The contractor finished in the nick of time before the terns got there, and the terns like to put material in their nests, and they also need shelter for the chicks, and there really just wasn't a lot. So the top left photo is actually a killdeer that's nesting out in the open, but you know, you can see some very small plants. That's what it looked like. And so the terns settled in, and they started devegetating all these little goldenrods that had just been planted just to put stuff in their nests. What we actually did was we gathered, you know, field grass and such, and we kind of threw it around the island so that we could provide a little starter material for the terns' nest. We also put out lots and lots of nest boxes for roseate terns for shelter. They're very trained on their nest boxes in Buzzards Bay. The bottom right, you can see some additional boards and things that we put out for extra shelter. But already by the time I took that photo, the goldenrods had grown quite nicely. We didn't anticipate that we would have common tern adults and roseate tern adults and fledglings going into the crevices in the stones. We were worried about unfledged chicks, but adults and fledglings of both species did explore those crevices. This really wasn't an issue for roseate terns. They are designed to be in crevices. They can climb with their wings, they can climb out. Common terns get in these crevices and they can't get out. So this was a very distressing problem for us. What we had to do to fix it was to chink the voids in the stones down to the high water mark. So we just used a smaller stone so that the birds wouldn't get stuck. And so we're constantly sort of looking for holes and such below that water line. The birds will float out with the tide, but above that, they would be stuck. And then we put some surplus material around the wall so we can repair as needed. The north end of the island, in the bottom photo, was a major staging area for material. There was a lot of stone dust that came off the stone piles, and there was a lot of heavy machinery use that compacted the nesting substrate. They also didn't put quite enough fill there, so we had a problem with drainage, and we had a problem with overwash. So the upper right photo shows an overwash event where a bunch of nests had gotten washed out, and a bird had collected a bunch of eggs in the nest subsequent to that. So that was really unfortunate. This had been a major common tern nesting area previous to the restoration, so we had to add more material to bring it up to the proper grade. And then there was a problem with the makeup of the material. There were too many fines in that material, and as a result, it wasn't draining properly. So we got sheeting of water across the island, a large portion of the island, including in our roseate tern nesting areas. You do not want to see ponding in your tern nesting areas. And this was very upsetting. We had, top right photo shows just a hole that we dug, a foot deep, and the level of water that had occurred in that. So, that was really unfortunate. There was nothing we could do about it at that time because it was, right during the nesting season, but it absolutely had to be fixed. So what we did in the off-season was we installed drainage ditches between these flooded areas and that cobble ring, and then connected the cobble ring to the revetment. So water shunts through those blue drainage ditches into that gray cobble ring and then off the island. So there are 2 points up north with the asterisks that show how the water is draining out. And then we had to cap the entire island with highly permeable fill. And this just shows what the drainage ditches look like on the ground. They're actually just cobble-filled ditches, and they're actually berms on top. There's extra material. So we've got no more problems with nesting material. We have so much vegetation that we need to control vegetation now. There's plenty of shelter for roseates. We seem to have fixed the entrapment problem. We need to do a little bit more monitoring, but it's probably fixed. The nesting substrate is great for them. No more problems with standing water, and no more overwash at a normal tidal cycle. It was really, really good that we had staged the construction, because if we'd done it all in one season, there would have been a lot more to fix later. We were able to rectify some of the problems before we went into the second season. Some of these problems resulted from how the contractor interpreted the specifications. We had to write the specifications in kind of a rush when there was federal funding available quickly. So there were some oversights there, but it's really hard to write a perfect specification. These things are like 200 pages long, so you're going to make some errors. So that's why it's especially important to have a lot of close coordination on the ground during construction to make sure things are going in the right direction. So just some before and after. So here's the before. The yellow line indicates the interface between the saltmarsh and the upland nesting habitat. Right after it was mostly completed in May 2017 and it was planted, this is what it looked like, pretty barren, but you can see those little polka dots of seaside goldenrod. A couple months later, it already looked like this. It's pretty amazing. Seaside goldenrod's my favorite plant. And then a couple years later, this is what it looks like. So it's quite a spectacular bit of fertilizer that the terns contribute to this process. So, okay, how did we do? Proof is in the pudding here. So we doubled the nesting habitat available to the terns. Went from 1 acre to 2, which is really something on a small island like that. We actually doubled the number of roseate tern pairs nesting on an island. This is incredible for a federally endangered species with an extremely limited distribution to increase the population size to that extent. We increased our share of the population from 27 to 36%. That's a plus or a minus, depending on how you look at it. It's the nature of working with roseate terns, but it's scary. And we also increased our common tern population by 50%. So looking at numbers of roseate terns in pink and common terns in blue over time, you can see how the numbers on Bird Island, the top figure, had kind of plateaued for quite a while. They really weren't going anywhere. They'd kind of been hovering around that 2,500, 3,000 pair mark total for a long time. We completed the project in 2018, and then you can just see how the numbers jumped up. Like, it made an enormous change in the carrying capacity of the island. And then the bottom figure shows Buzzards Bay as a whole. So this is Bird, Ram, and Penakees Islands together, where we're managing, where Mass Wildlife is managing these tern populations. It really drove that increase in population for Buzzards Bay. And for the Northeast population as a whole, you can imagine when you only have 3 major nesting sites, whatever happens at one of those sites has the potential to have a very large impact on the population as a whole. And that's great when it's a positive change. It's not so great when it's a negative change. But in this case, we've been very fortunate that this restoration worked out. As all of you knowing who work with these restorations know, it's, as Deirdre said, it's a team sport. There are lots of people to thank, but I'll leave it here. Are there any restoration plans for Ram Island? Yes, we're actually in the planning process for Ram Island right now. We have some funding available from the settlement for the Bouchard oil spill that we'll be using, and we've done an alternatives analysis, and we have just finished the restoration plan that'll be out for NEPA review shortly. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I see that there's multiple questions up on the slide. I hope Carolyn's staying through lunch so that folks can approach her there. Okay, next up we have our last speaker of the saltwater session, Jody King. Jody is a Narragansett Bay quahogger who grew up in Warwick as the oldest of 4 boys. He has fond memories of playing at Rocky Point Beach, digging clams with his parents and brothers. As Jody will tell us today, he has spent more than half his life in a career of digging quahogs and falling in love with it. Thanks, Jody. You can come on up.
Thank you, Darcy. Thank you, Courtney. This is called The Wild Things, and I am absolutely the wild thing on Narragansett Bay. I am a commercial shell fisherman. I am a quahogger. I am, like, when I do presentations, I like to confuse people. I'm a commercial bivalve extractor extraordinaire. I hope through my eyes, growing up as a child, I can show you what Narragansett Bay meant to me growing up with 4 boys, 3 younger brothers. I have spent more than half of my life, I'm 60, almost 63, I've spent more than half of my life harvesting commercial quahogs. I've done other things. I've been inshore and offshore dragging. I've been inshore and offshore lobstering. This is the one job that brought me home every single night so I could do what I love most, that's hang out with my beautiful wife in the back. And I'd like to show you where it's gone and where I would like to see it be in the future. There are 4 buckets. My fondest memory, this is mine, my color is blue. My mother had 4 boys. We peed on the toilet all the time. She also made sure that we also had our own colors. So mine was blue, the toothbrush was blue, the bucket was blue. When we went down to the beach, and my favorite place that I remember as a child, my parents bringing us to Rocky Point. We could either swim in the pool for 25 cents a piece all day, Olympic-sized swimming pool that was used in the 1939 Olympics, or we went to a little tiny private beach called Rocky Point Beach. It's a little tiny beach that if you don't live in the neighborhood, you just don't know about it. And I can remember my parents walking us down to the beach, and my father looking at all of us very sternly. There was one time that he was stern. Don't go past that street. Don't go past those rocks. Please don't kill one another. And get some quahogs so we can have some dinner. It's where I cut my teeth, I sort of say, in my shellfishing world. If you had asked me 50 plus years ago if catching these quahogs on a beach with my brothers was going to be my profession or my chosen job, I would have told you you were crazy. I had other things in life at 9 or 10 years old that I really wanted to do, and quahogging was not one of them. Things were way different in the 60s and 70s with regards to where you could go on a beach. We combed 39 miles of Warwick's waterfront, because that's what it has, and we got to use most of it. Nowadays, we have a whole bunch of areas that are closed to shellfishing, and we've kind of learned where the pollution is and where we need to go and where we shouldn't go. And my parents also taught us a lot of things while combing around for quahogs on that beach when we sat down for lunch. One of those things was both of my parents are professional chefs. When the kids came along, my mother went to her chosen profession that was taking care of 4 of us. What a job. She did not get paid enough. And my father was a professional chef from 16 years old, or 15 years old, I should say, when he went in the Navy. He found his passion. He really, really did. He loved cooking. I got to watch him. I worked in restaurants with him. I was a busboy at the Fireside Inn. Proudest moment of my life was watching my father come out of the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night when the kitchen was closed, with a brand new white coat on, checked pants, and walk around the room. You knew he loved his job, because he could tell you where every piece of food, from vegetable to fish to cohogs to shellfish, where it came from in his restaurant. And it was kind of cool to watch your dad walk around and take all the accolades and have a beer with some of what he called his friends. And he told us a long time ago, if you guys get to find a job, and I know you all love cooking with us because it's something I did growing up, really growing up as a kid. Here I am cooking with my dad. 1984, I believe that says, or 94, in the kitchen with him. How many people can work with a parent and never have an argument? We never argued, but if you put my mother in that same kitchen, all heck would have broke loose. So we told all 4 of us, if you get to find a job that treats you like this one does, for me, I love my job. I love what I do for a living. It's almost like not going to work. I'm the oldest of 4. Born 6 years to the day. I can remember my mother calling from the hospital on February 14th and saying, I have your birthday present. It's a baby brother. And that long extension cord got real long. Mom, I told you I wanted a train set. Send him back. She couldn't, so I have what both of us affectionately call is our identical twin. He's my twin, I'm his twin. When he introduced me 10 years ago to all his friends down in Texas, this is my twin born 6 years before me. We are both captains. I captain a 25-foot boat, same boat for 30 years. The only thing that's changed on it is the dog. My dad has passed, and the ever-changing motor on the back of my boat. I'm the captain of a ship. That's my boat. My twin, not really my twin, but yes, is a captain on a Gulfstream jet that does 600 miles an hour. He absolutely loves his job. My brother Dana, he does construction. He did doors, windows, and awnings. He's really, really good at it, and he loves it. My brother Tracy, how do I describe Tracy? I'll start off with, he was a lover of his children. He had 3 boys, and he loved being home with them. He really, really did. He's not with us anymore. You all are Rhode Islanders, or most of you. My brother was a bouncer at the Station nightclub. He walked in and out of that place 9 times before the 10th time he didn't walk out. Everybody has a pain in the neck, brother. He was mine. We argued over a square foot, how many dandelions could possibly be in that square foot. Sometimes it was to blood, sometimes it was to a good discussion, and at the end we always said, I'm sorry, let's not let that happen again. That really stunk, that fight we just had. But we all found professions that we love. This is the job I should have said yes to 50 years ago, because it is the job that I've been doing for well over 30 years. I absolutely love my job. Who has a better picture window at their job than me? No one. I've got Narragansett Bay. That's my picture window. So we all chose jobs that our father and our mothers sort of told us to do. Find the job that loves you, and it'll love you back. It's almost not like going to work. I get paid, and I say this all the time, I get paid to go to the gym. I haven't been to the gym in well over 30 years. There is nobody in this room that can out-squeeze at 63 years old these hands. These are muscles. They work really, really hard. I hold back a 5,000-pound boat, sometimes 8 days a week, You can ask my wife, she's right up in the back, how many days a week do I go to work? I work about 250 to 275 days a year. On average, this is an undersize, I just brought it for demonstration purposes, and it's not a lie. I catch on average between 200 and 225, 230,000 of these every year. The beauty about cohogs, I think Conor was alluding to it earlier, and he was hoping that he didn't take the wind out of my sails, so to speak. Never, not on my job. These little babies, this is about 11 years old, 10 years old, and if you age them, they age like a tree, 4 rings to a year. These filter heavily, 25 gallons of water per day each clam filters. They take in what they want, they filter out what they don't want, and they store the rest of the garbage in their shells. So we've all found our jobs. I found mine. This is my passion. 30 years ago, when I drove out of Warwick Cove, and I had a horrible commute every morning. My friends joke with me. I walk out my front door with one of my dogs. I've had 2 on my boat. My last name's King. My first dog's name was what? Princess. I walk out my door every morning, and some mornings I drive my truck to the boat, which is about 500 feet away. I hop in my boat, and I get the pleasure of driving on Narragansett Bay for 25 minutes. My primary place that I love to go is Barrington Beach. Area 1A, Conor alluded to the prime areas of digging. This is where I make most of my living these days. I've been in Barrington Beach for now 17 years, I'll never be a millionaire, I'll tell you that right now, but I am going to be the happiest clammer in the world. This is the area I make most of my living. That's the area, that's the spot. That's the spot where I turn little tiny pieces of black into gold. As they come out of the water black, when I turn them in at my dealer, they turn to gold. For me, everything turns to gold. And all these other circles are areas that we've worked in the past. Historically, we used to dig down in Quonset, Pine Hill, over by Potter's Cove, in between the islands. These have all died off. Because 30 years ago when I drove out of the cove, I'd come out of my cove, I'd go around Warwick Light, and I would see 2,000 shellfishermen. Literally. You'd lose count by the time you got 2 minutes into your ride. How many did I have? Shoot, gotta start again. And you'd lose count again. There were that many guys on the water back 30 years ago. Today, it's hard to count them because there's only about 30 of us that do this for a living, and they're scattered because we're all over the bay now. We're trying to find clams. Something's happened. We can't figure it out, but what I can tell you is if there are clams in Narragansett Bay, there are fishermen here to catch them. If there aren't clams, the fishermen that can't do this for a full-time guy, because this is the only, Conor said we multitask or multi-fish. I don't multitask, I don't multi-fish. I've had the opportunities to do it. I found the one fish that I love to catch, and it's cohogs. That's all I do, is catch cohogs. That's my primary income, is shellfish. I do other things. None of them have to do with fishing. Yeah, sort of. Most of them have nothing to do with fishing. I plow during the winter. Last winter, what was that? 1 storm. That wasn't very productive, and this summer I'm paying for all the damages of 9 years of plowing before that, because my truck just cost me almost $12,000, because I'm a Boy Scout and I have to be prepared for winter. So that truck just cost me about $12,000 just to fix all the damages of the past 9 years of plowing. I teach, so there's the other way I make a living, and I teach at a multitude of places. This is one of my favorite places I taught. It was at Brown University. I'm not a professor. I taught at Brown University. It's called the Bell Program, Brown Environmental Learning and Leadership. These are the most brilliant of brilliant children that went to Brown University between 14 and 17, and I taught there for 10 years. And I used to ask the kids to sign a book, you know, your name and where you're from, and it's your name and what country do you pick from. A couple of years later, your name, because I don't get feedback on how I'm doing with my job, I just love giving out this kind of information. Your name, where you're from, and maybe a line or, you know, something about what you're going to take away from this 13-hour day that I'm going to spend with you. And then I started asking, can you give me your name, where you're from, and write, like, the book's going to be here for 13 hours, so write something besides a line. And 14 to 17-year-olds, you don't expect to write anything, and then it goes to paragraphs. And I'm going to drop stuff purposely that these children would write, because they write me notes. I had one child in the class, and very few are from Rhode Island in this program. One of them, she had fuchsia hair. I should never prejudice, because I did for a split second and I was wrong. She was the most intelligent child in that class that day. I shuck little necks, I shuck oysters, I bring mussels, steamers, and lobsters to the class, to cook with the class, to show them what Rhode Island's bay can offer them. And in the oysters I get from Westerly, it's from a friend of mine, Jeff Gardner, down in Weekapog Pond. Out of the 100 oysters he sent me, I got 7 pearls. Kind of cool. I mean, they're tiny pearls, very tiny pearls. And this girl with fuchsia hair happened to get 4. 32 students, she got 4. Writing in my book. She comes up to me after class to show me her oysters, and I tell her how cool they are, and I tell the story of what I've done with the very few pearls that I've gotten. Both of my goddaughters own them. One guilted me into it, and the other got it because she deserved it. Where was I going with that? Oh, the fuchsia-colored hair girl walked up to me and she goes, I got 4 pearls, but I want you to have 1. And I said, why did you give me that pearl? That's for you. She looks me right in the eyes with that fuchsia-colored hair and goes, that's for all the pearls of wisdom you gave us today. I was like, crap. So when I'm having a bad day, these are the books I pick up, because these children, these young adults, wrote the most beautiful things about the 13 hours that they had with me. Conor alluded to rain events and closures. When we get, I want to say about 10, 12 years ago, before we put tunnels in the ground to store all this rainwater and gray water that we have, it would take a ½ inch of water to close this section of the bay. And I'd be stuck in this section, somewhere around in here. Usually I hide over here in Potter's Cove. This week we've had 3 weekends of continuous rain. We've had 3 weeks of closures from my favorite section of the bay. So I've been stuck here. And over here, I can work 5 or 6 hours, and maybe pick up the rake 12 times in the course of 5 or 6 hours. I figured out how to dig clams. I am not only the best at digging clams, it's been quoted. So let me find the quote. It's written in big letters that I'm the king, excuse the name, king of the bay. And I used to be afraid to say I'm good at what I do, but after 33 years, I think I get to deserve the term the king of the bay. Where am I? I'm somewhere in, oh, Courtney, I found you. But somewhere in here, I'm called the king of the bay. That was 2 years ago. 3 years ago, I graduated from URI. I have 2 degrees. I really don't have to do this for a living. It shows me. I could sit in an office with no windows. That's not happening here. In my 30 years, I get to see the beauty of Narragansett Bay. And my favorite thing to see on Narragansett Bay is sunrises. I see more sunrises in 1 year than most of you will see in your entire lifetime. 250 days a year, I get to see at least 200 sunrises. Some are obscured by clouds. Quahogs are the one true fish of Rhode Island. They don't move. They live here. They stay here. They're born here. How far do they move? They have a leg and they have a siphon. This is their leg side of a quahog. This is the siphon side. They got one leg. How far are they going to move their whole life? Until I pick them up and I go, I'm taking you home, and I can't take it home for dinner. That's the funny part of this. I can't even eat these when I go home. It's not that I can't. It's my wife. When I met her 17 years ago, 1 year after we met, she became highly allergic to all shellfish. How ironic. We both grow up in Rhode Island, and she becomes allergic. Anybody know how to age a quahog? Count the rings. You got a microscope? A lot of rings. 4 rings to a year on a quahog. This quahog is about 75 years old. I caught one once. What? 2 minutes? Come on! I caught one once that fit in my hand and you couldn't see my fingers. You got to give me more than 2 minutes. I still got pages to flip. Are you hungry? Just give me a minute. I say I am just a quahogger. And that's what I do for a living, and I am just a quahogger. I have the best picture window in the world. More than half my life has been spent digging just shellfish. I will never be a millionaire. This is a 12-month-a-year job. Courtney, you can sit down. This is a 12-month-a-year job. I get to see 4 seasons from a place that most people don't get to see the seasons change from. And that's my boat. I actually look at the forest and see trees already changing. Now my rake. This is my handle, and I work from my boat sort of like this. This is my rake. And yesterday, when I got off the water at 12:30, this is how far away I was from my rake. Let's save about 6 feet, because that's what stays in the boat. So I pigged clams in my boat. Yesterday it was 22 and a half, almost 23 feet away. I pour through the bottom with almost 50 feet of aluminum stale attached to a handle, and I dig through the bottom and collect clams. And I'm really, really good at it. One of my best friends, when I started this job, and I didn't know anybody that did quahogging. I just started it because my father was retiring from work. They weren't going to let me take his position at the Marriott. I said, I cannot have a boss. There is no way. I just have the best dad in the world, the best boss. We never argue. Who am I going to work for? So I decided to go quahog. And I bought a boat, I bought a license, and I started shellfishing. What a mistake that was. Because nobody was willing to teach me at the time. I had to learn. And my roommate in college and my best friend looked at me when I started this job, and he goes, and he's a lawyer and an accountant. He looks at me and goes, Jody, what are you going to do here? Where are you going to go shellfishing? It took him 15 years before he finally came up to me and recanted his statement. He goes, you know, Jody, when I made that statement 15 years ago about where are you going to go and what are you going to do, I was absolutely wrong. I had no idea you would have taken just quahogging and gone to the lengths and extents that you have. All of you use computers. I can't even use this for a screen. I have right here my clamputer. And this is all the questions in the 15 or so years that I've been teaching, the odd questions that people ask me in class. They're all inside a quahog shell. And those quahogs range in questions from, and I was just given my first one today as a gift, what is wampum. This is wampum. This is the purple part of the inside of the shell. Nancy, thank you very much. She just gave me my first wampum necklace. Who is the most famous person that you've had on the boat? That's all right. I have a lot of things fall. Most famous person on the boat was quite a few years ago. They sent me this in the mail after the show was produced. You know what this is, right? This is Food Nation. This is Bobby Flay came to Rhode Island. He was doing a show called Taste of the Nation. I'm 25 minutes of a 1-hour show. And my latest question that hasn't even made it into my computer was asked of me last week at a Come Clam With Me event, because I teach a Come Clam With Me class. And this young lady from Palestine looks me in the eye and goes, I gotta ask you a question, Joey. Has race ever played a part in your life when you were growing up? And I kind of stood there and went, wow, that's mad. And, or, has it ever played a part in your profession? So I got to tell them a couple of stories of what this has meant to me growing up here in Rhode Island, and what has happened to me in my shellfishing life with regards to race. What do I see in the future for cohogging? Well, this is my closing, and as I've always hoped, being on the Marine Fisheries Council and Vice President of the Rhode Island Shellfish Association, I always said, I hope when I leave my industry or my job that it's in better condition now or later in life than it is before I started. I know I said that a little wrong, but I really hope that it would be in better condition when I get ready to retire. And it's not. And this is part of what we're working on now. I just got put on a commission. I'm called the Quahog Czar in Rhode Island. I was appointed by the governor to be one of 13 members in a panel that talks about what's happened with regards to shellfishing in the Narragansett Bay, where the shellfish have actually gone. Because if there are quahogs here, there would be 2,000 of us to dig them. I am only the strong survive. I have survived in this job for 30 plus years doing just quahogs. And we are tasked by the governor and the state to figure out where the clams have gone and why they've disappeared so much and why there aren't any shellfish. And I can tell you why there aren't any shellfish. My mantra growing up, and my mother gave me this a long, long time ago, and it's stuck with me. It's on my business cards and everything. Good, better, best. Never let it rest until good is better and better is best. That's how I sort of treated my shellfishing life. I'm glad I've been finally put on a commission of some sorts, and Conor is going to come speak next month about the health of Narragansett Bay. We've done great things in Narragansett Bay. You can drink the salt water that comes out of Narragansett Bay now. We've done such great things. 30 years ago, when a heavy rain happened, turd and all sorts of stuff came out of the upper bay on an outgoing high tide. We haven't seen that in well over 20 years because we've been very good to Narragansett Bay. I think I'm going to leave you there and ask if there are any questions. I love my job, still at 30 years. How many people can say at 30 plus years they still love their job? I don't set an alarm. I just get up and go. Any questions? I can't see the screen, so you gotta help me out. Any questions? Go ahead, I like this.
I think you're the first quahogger I ever met that divulges a secret spot.
And I do that for a reason. I teach a Come Clam With Me class. I have no biological children. I have no one to give all of this stupid wisdom to. And I really need to help people understand the importance of quahogs on Narragansett Bay. So that's the reason I've been giving out my spots. And I had a spot in North Kingston. I could go dig 1,000 little nets. Every day I went down there in the spring. Now I bring pants pockets and I hop in the water and I dig a couple of pockets full. Because I've given out that information. And when I take you to a pond or a place to dig quahogs, you are going to continually walk back into that place until you can't find them anymore. And that's the way it goes. not just one thing that's helped get the bay to where it is. It's an accumulation of multiple things. Some of it is man-influenced. We try to act like God. We are not. God does things right and does things right once. We have to trial and error. I think one of the speakers said something about we got to keep on trying. That's one of those things. And the turns. Why don't we put those biometric things on the turns so you don't have to go hug around in a nest and find them? Any other questions?
What do you think about the 7-foot quahogs that are in airports around the country these days?
I love them because I'm the talking TV screen right in front of the quahog. Anybody else?
Have you ever clammed a gooey duck?
No, I have not. This is as big as a gooey duck I've ever gotten. And actually, the clam that I caught years ago that was way bigger than my hand was 150 years old. And the only way they knew it is they drilled a hole in it and they determined how thick the shell was and killed my quahog for me. But this one's 75 years old, at least twice this old. Quahogs are one of the few animals on Earth that if we leave them alone, they're going to just continue growing and continue growing. 400 years old, the main quahog in, I forget what country it is, it's New Zealand, I believe it is. 400 years old. Kind of big. Any other questions before we go to lunch?
I think, I don't know, you've made me pretty hungry. I don't know about everybody else. Thank you so much, Jody. And thank you to all of our speakers this morning. Okay. Let's come back at 1:10, 1:10 after lunch, and we'll come back for our freshwater session. Food's in the same room